All right, we've got a great podcast ahead with Martin Feehan, MassWildlife's deer and moose biologist. We talk about the state of the deer and moose herds in Massachusetts, the trends that we've been seeing over the year. We talk about how MassWildlife determines deer densities across the state. We get into CWD and some of the threats to our wild herds in Massachusetts and steps that we can all take to prevent the spread of these diseases that could impact our herds, as well as go over the new proposed hunting regulations that MassWildlife is putting before the Fish and Game Board for approval. These regulations are things that are going to make hunting more accessible for folks. There's nothing within these regulations that is going to take access away. It's all about providing more access for hunters across the state. So we go through all of those regulations and talk about there is a public hearing. So if you're listening to this, you want to attend that public hearing. We put the links in the description of the YouTube video here on how you can be a part of that hearing. There's 2 hearings taking place tomorrow, January 23rd. One is at 1:30 p.m. The other one is at 6 p.m. So try to attend one of those. If you have comments about these regulations and you want to make your voice heard, that's a great time to do it. I encourage everybody to join who can. The fact that they have 2 hearings should make it easy for you guys to at least be able to attend one of those. So I highly encourage that you do so. There's a ton of great stuff in here. We talk about the health of the herd, things like our mature buck structure in Massachusetts. We talk about things like when do deer actually shed their antlers? Is there any science behind factors that contribute to them shedding earlier or later, holding on to their antlers later? We talk about the peak, what Martin feels like is the peak of a mature buck's antler potential in the Northeast and how that might differ from some Midwestern states. The CWD and other diseases that can possibly affect our wild herds. How do we have preventative measures to make sure that CWD doesn't make its way here, because we're one of the last states where it has not been infiltrated into the herd. So there's so much awesome knowledge in here. Listen to the whole thing. The regulation talk happens at the end, but there's all kinds of great information and insight from a very knowledgeable source in our state deer and moose biologist. So make sure you listen to the whole thing. If you just want to listen to the regulation stuff, or you want to listen to that first, we'll put the timestamp below in the description. And I also want to take this time to just mention Huntstock. Huntstock tickets are back on sale. We've got dates. The Massachusetts event, again, at Wildwood Farm, and it's August 8th through the 10th this year. We're bringing in some new seminar speakers. We've got John Eberhart coming, and we're working on a bunch of other nationally known seminar speakers, as well as we'll have our staples, some really great hunters from the Northeast, from Massachusetts, from Maine, from New Hampshire, talking about all kinds of hunting, not just deer hunting. There's a little bit of something for everybody. If you haven't been to Huntstock yet, we would love to see you. Huntstock is basically what we're trying to do is strengthen the Northeastern hunting community through innovative festival experiences, always coming up with new entertainment, and just trying to do a hunting show a little bit differently than how they've been done in the past. We don't allow non-hunting related brands to be in our expo. Everything is highly curated to be something that is of value to us as hunters. And what we're trying to do is just instill that, bring that pride, that sense of pride back to us Northeastern hunters, and give us a really exciting show that inspires that next generation. We talk about it a little bit on this podcast. We are, our hunter numbers are dwindling. That is one of the focuses of MassWildlife, and passing new regulations is making hunting more accessible. so that we can defeat the declining license sales numbers that they've been seeing, over the past decade or so. So we're really proud of what we've built at Huntstock. Huntstock's only going to work if more people come to experience it. We have more brands, exhibitors that want to come and be a part of it. If you're interested in exhibiting at Huntstock, send me an email to huntsuburbia@gmail.com. We'll get you over the info. We just ask that you take pride in your booth, you offer something of value back to the hunting community, and you don't sit behind your table with pamphlets and be boring. We just don't want boring exhibitors. Everything is about the attendee experience and just having an overall great time and celebrating this tradition that we all love so much. So go to huntstockevents.com, get your tickets early. Anybody who buys their tickets before March 1st to Huntstock will get double the door prize entries. That's one of the staples at Huntstock. We give away more than $30,000 of gear back to the attendees, including bows, guns, muzzleloaders, optics, hunts, camo, gear, saddles, sticks, all kinds of awesome stuff. So yeah, get your tickets before March 1st. You'll have double the opportunity, double the chance of winning some of those great prizes. And we just look forward to seeing you guys all at Huntstock. And MassWildlife is there. They have a booth. You can talk with Martin there. Martin will also be doing a seminar and a Q&A at Huntstock as well. So yeah, support Huntstock, support Massachusetts hunting, and keep this tradition alive that we love so much. Let's get into the podcast now. Here he is, MassWildlife's deer and moose biologist, Martin Feehan. Okay, welcome back to another episode of the Hunt Suburbia podcast, and today I'm joined by Martin Feehan, the MassWildlife deer and moose biologist, and the wildlife health specialist, right?
Yep.
Thanks for coming, man. Appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
Why don't we just start out by you telling everybody what you do, what your role is at MassWildlife?
Yeah, so the main part of my job really is on the deer management end. And so as the deer biologist, I oversee really all aspects of deer management here in Massachusetts, from regulations to monitoring the harvest, doing any kind of disease monitoring. I oversee all permitting for captive deer facilities. I work across the entire region with all of my other counterparts in terms of the Northeast Deer Technical Committee, and really kind of every aspect there in terms of deer management. Another aspect of my job is the moose management side, which is a much smaller portion of the job. It makes up about probably 10-15% of my job. And that's predominantly dealing with moose conflict. When we have moose that end up in places like Worcester or Marlborough and such, and in those places, it becomes kind of a safety risk. And so a lot of that is having to dart the moose and then move them to other locations. But then on top of that, also monitoring for different wildlife health threats with them, particularly with winter tick now being a major issue, and then also with brainworm. And then the last piece is a relatively new part with the wildlife health specialist piece. I'm the principal investigator on our grant, about $750,000 grant from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to develop a formal wildlife health program underneath the Zoonotic Disease Initiative. And so with that, we're working across all of our agency, but also all of our partner agencies to really develop the formal wildlife health program. So that way we can protect our wild herds, but then also protect people in terms of zoonotic disease threats as well.
So what are some ways in which you guys can spend those funds to help protect? Like, how is that going to be utilized?
Yeah, so there's actually quite a few aspects to this project. So we have a new wildlife health coordinator that is part of this. And so Sarah Vandenberg is working on developing the data management sides in terms of storing all the different disease data, diagnostic testing, those kinds of things, and making it so that we can share across all of our different staff. Which is really important as we see a lot of disease threats like HPAI really go across a lot of different species boundaries. Also working on developing communication materials, education materials, so we can really talk to the public in an effective manner. We also are funding a PhD student that I co-advise with Dr. Grace Dorenzo at the UMass Massachusetts Cooperative Research Unit. And Jill, our PhD student on that, is going to be working on a lot of One Health aspects of how we manage health in a manner that includes both the wildlife, domesticated animals, human health, as well as the environmental health. And also developing a network of diagnostic labs. One of the challenges we face here in New England is we have really small states that each individually don't have the resources necessarily to combat all these things and get the information we need. But collectively, we really have sort of that strength in numbers across the region. And so a big part of our ZDI program was really to integrate that and have a really regional approach. And so we're building a regional network of diagnostic labs and pathology labs. We are also setting up our whole program so that way our development could then be replicated in other states, because all of our small states, it's hard to get these things started. And, if we can make sure that the pitfalls we fall into don't have to be replicated by other states, those kinds of things. And so that's kind of the big pieces, but there's a lot of pieces underneath that, including developing rapid response teams and communication teams across agencies. So that way, when there are issues, like right now dealing with HPAI being a perfect example, being able to have that interaction of agencies is really critical.
How often do you communicate with the biologists from Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire, neighboring states?
Across the Deer Tech Committee, we are in contact probably nearly weekly. So like just this last week, we were discussing regulations that each state has when it comes to being able to actually sample for things like CWD and making sure that there's a legal obligation there. We do a lot of things of trying to make sure we address regulatory gaps between each state. We don't have to start from scratch on most things.
Yeah.
Each of these things, whitetail deer are in 49 of the 50 states, and so we can really utilize a lot of information.
What's the 50th state is not in? Vermont, right? Because there's no deer up there.
But it's one of those things that we can really develop a lot of the stuff across all the states, and so we stay in really close communication on a lot of issues. And other things like the CWD case, being able to actually know the biologist that's working on these cases. In a state like when New York had their recent case, that's kind of thing that we're able to, utilize those channels very effectively.
When it comes to like herd management and hunting regulations, do you guys sometimes talk with each other? A biologist from a different state and go over all the data and communicate things that have been effective in each state, and then does that influence maybe some of the regulations that we try to put forward sometimes?
Yeah, absolutely. So every single year, we are charged by the Northeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies to develop a report for each individual state, and then those reports then collectively go underneath the technical committee. And that includes actually pretty high level data. So getting down to, actual sex ratios, harvest, getting at licenses, the different kinds of regulatory changes that each states are doing, each of their individual programs. And all of that, then when we have our in-person meeting each year, we do a deep dive of, this is something new that we tried in this state, and these were the shortcomings, these are where it really excelled, this is how we're going to modify it. And then on the flip side there, too, is also really working on the research side of it. And so we are, in each of the states, when they're working on all the different research projects that are going on, whether it be disease management, whether it be habitat management, or, really across the board on demographics of deer, all of that information then is really collated by the technical committee. And so then we're able to pull some of that. And so certainly when we're putting together regulatory packages, a lot of that is drawn directly from other states. A good example here, we have a new regulation package that'll be going to hearing this week that includes an exception allowing for hunting over food plots. And the language we actually used from that directly essentially was built off of 3 other states. So that way, other states have already had to have this. They've already had to see what causes issues there. And so we can then use that to then develop our regulations.
Yeah. And I imagine, though, just within the state of Massachusetts, the deer herds, moose herds, the moose herds are more, central and west. There's nothing really east. But when you look at deer herds, sometimes the regulations and even the season lengths, the bag limits, you see it with the doe permits, the antlerless deer permits that are allocated. Each zone is kind of its own unique ecosystem and has its own unique populations and hurdles. So I would imagine it's kind of hard to take what another state has learned and try to apply it to Massachusetts in many cases, right?
Yeah, certainly it's all very site specific. But when you look at the actual characteristics of each one of those zones in our state, those will have similar proxies in other states.
Yeah.
And so while
Western Mass is more like Vermont's big woods.
Exactly. So with that, then you're not necessarily taking another state and ever replicating those programs. It really wouldn't be possible, as each state has both different habitat on the ground and the landscape's very different, but then also different cultural histories of hunting and different regulatory and really statutory limitations. But it's more seeing like the unique kinds of permits that might be done, or things like bonus buck systems, or all of those kinds of things. Many of the suggestions that we get, like when we're going through a hearing process, we'll get a lot of comments on things that people would like to see us do, even though the hearing process isn't really meant to be that exactly set up that way for folks to be using it that way. But we still end up with a lot of those comments that go in, and a lot of what people suggest, I think oftentimes hunters think it's sort of a unique thing that they're bringing to the table, when reality is across all of our states, we've talked through all those. And most of the time, deer biologists, we are really advocating on behalf of hunters to be able to really have as much flexibility, as much opportunity as possible. And usually if we're not doing something, it's usually because it's has particular limitations, and the applications in another state that hunters may hunt in don't necessarily apply in in a different jurisdiction.
Yeah. For instance, I mean, I grew up in Vermont hunting out of a deer camp. It's been in my family forever. I didn't really start hunting Massachusetts until 2019, and just, noticing immediately, at deer camp, if you saw one or two deer in a day, that was a good day. You certainly wouldn't see big bucks hardly ever. I mean, a buck like that one right there on the right would be the biggest deer shot on the road for the year. Mm-hmm. And when I first started hunting Massachusetts, really scouting before the season, I mean, I saw 4 or 5 of those on, one trail camera, and I was like, whoa, because it didn't connect with me for some reason. I had always tied hunting to my deer camp and that way of hunting, that type of herd. And I just didn't think, for me, I was, especially in the suburbs, I know you specialize in some urban deer populations and things like that. We'll get into that. It didn't click that would be a good place for deer. I don't know why, but, now that I've been in it, the last 6 years, it's just evident that different places with different cultures. I believe one of the reasons why Vermont, has fewer deer, has smaller bucks, has a worse mature buck age structure than I think Massachusetts does, is because of the culture there. It's always been a shoot whatever you see culture, which is fine, and that's the culture there. But those types of cultural differences can lead to mature age, mature buck class and age structure and buck to doe ratios and populations. And I think we should start there a little bit maybe. Why don't we talk about the state of the Massachusetts deer herd, and then we'll get into moose. But how do you feel about the state of the herd right now, and where there may be issues?
Yeah, I mean, I would essentially break the state up into really 4 regions of the state, and we can talk about those kind of individually because they're very different stories going on. In the Connecticut Valley, even through much of the western portions of the state, other than the very western zones of zones 1 and 3, much of that portion of the state has mostly contiguous forest, a lot of mature canopy, and the densities are relatively where we'd like them to be. Lots of large deer coming out of there. It's much tougher hunting, and so folks who want to be able to really, hike in, be able to get more of that backcountry type hunting experience, those are the areas where you can really get that kind of a hunting feel. It's much more kind of your traditional style of hunting. And particularly, you got hunts like the Quabbin special hunts where you can also get access to property you normally don't get to hunt. That region in general is where the deer population is sort of an ideal biologically. You're not having too much impact on the forests, and most of those areas are areas where we would really like to be able to just kind of maintain.
And what's that range? What is that ideal range? Is it 12 to 18 per square mile there?
Yeah, so our mandated range is 12 to 18 deer per square mile as the goal across the entire state. And in that region, we're generally getting right around 13 to about 16 deer per square mile in areas that are open to hunting. It's in areas that are closed to hunting, densities are going to be higher just because you don't have that harvest mortality. And certainly there are areas, even within that region, where we see densities creeping up quite a bit. We see that in the areas around Amherst, for example, and Northampton, where there have been a lot of restrictions recently on hunting. And that's something that even the conservation commissions there are trying to hopefully address, because there's concerns from folks who are trying to see more restrictions put on hunters in those areas. And then also around like the Springfield suburbs as well, where certainly there's a lot of restrictions in that region. And so those are some of the spots throughout that portion of the state where you still are seeing some issues of overabundant deer, and predominantly just due to lack of access. In Western Mass, the very western edges with zones 1 and 3, we're starting to see the densities start to creep up more than we'd like.
I saw that on the map. What's the reason for that?
I think a lot of it has to do with what's going on in the adjacent states. So in that region, you have close proximity with northwestern Connecticut, the Hudson Valley of New York, and then that southern reach of Vermont. And in those areas, deer densities are creeping up quite a bit, and I think you're starting to have spillover from there. We've also seen a lot of restrictions recently start to creep up, particularly in the Berkshires, with new residents that are not used to hunting and pushing on the end. And that's certainly something that I have to work on a lot. A lot of my day-to-day job is working with communities when new proposals are put forth to add restrictions, trying to explain why you don't want to go that route, particularly for conservation commissions where their mandate is to conserve land. It's really important for them to understand that if they put those restrictions, they can be working against their actual responsibilities as a conservation commission. And then you have the Eastern Mass, really everything from Worcester East, Zone 9, 10, 11, and to some extent Zone 12 with the Cape Cod, but not quite as heavy there, where we have really high growing densities. And most of that is from restrictions of access. I mean, certainly many places don't allow any hunting. There are a lot of areas that have it restricted to only bow hunting. You have access issues of just getting to property.
Many towns that are just written permission only and literally no public land to hunt.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is also where the setback restriction also really rears its head as a major problem, the 500-foot setback.
Yep.
And this is something where we hear all the time from constituents who are trying to advocate to MassWildlife to make that change. But ultimately, there are things like setbacks and Sunday hunting and crossbow limitations. Those are purely statutory, and the only way that those can change is for the hunting community to advocate with their legislators, because they have to actually have a change in law. We can only modify regulation as an agency. We can't modify laws. And that's where certainly, the hunting community being able to advocate for those things would be very helpful.
So for people listening that don't know what their legislature means, that's contacting their local congressman?
Yeah, exactly. Their local either representative or state senator, for both of them to be able to advocate. There are bills that are put forth almost every single legislative session to modify these, and if legislators can hear enough from their constituents, some of these proposals might move forward. We've gotten really close the last few years on a couple of these, particularly having universal crossbow, which would be very effective. Right now, I know there's already a bill that was already introduced here in January that includes opening up universal crossbow, so anyone can use crossbow, not just those who are permanently disabled. Also reducing setbacks for archery to 250 feet. From a deer management perspective, I would rather see us go down to 150 feet for setbacks, and that's really what I advocate for when we meet with legislators, because at 150 feet, that's more going to help you in those really urban corridors, and it also matches the most restrictive in bordering states as well. Several of our border states don't have any restrictions at all, and when you look at like New York, where it's at 150 feet, I think that's very replicatable here in Massachusetts.
So everybody's got different opinions, obviously, on pretty much any new regulation or new statute that would come out. The crossbow one is one that I hear from people all the time, and that if you introduced a universal crossbow, what do you foresee that could do to? Yeah, it would probably help with the overall harvest numbers with reducing doe populations, but if you extrapolate that out, how does that affect maybe our age structure, buck to doe ratios? Does that come into consideration at all when you guys are thinking about that and advocating for things like a universal crossbow?
Crossbow is not likely to have much of an impact on many of those aspects in the areas where those are concerns. I mean, when we're talking about age structure concerns and the size of deer and all those aspects, those are really when we're talking in those areas of Connecticut Valley and western portions of the state where you have those lower densities. And it's not going to have anywhere near as much adoption because there we already have a lot of primitive hunters and shotgun hunters because of the lack of limitations there on those implements. And so you may see some switch over to crossbow, but it's not going to be anywhere near as ubiquitous as what you'd have in Eastern Mass. In Eastern Mass, where you have so many restrictions on the use of firearms, that's where we would potentially be able to turn over a lot of firearm hunters to crossbow hunters and allow them to actually activate, where right now they essentially don't hunt at all in Eastern Mass because they can't access that because they are strictly a firearm hunter. And so that's really where, when I'm advocating for universal crossbow, it is really for those urban areas where all of a sudden you'd have all these hunters that never access those areas, then now would be able to actually go hunting in those communities.
And it's always a double-edged sword. Like, that's great to allow more access, right? But in those areas, I think you would see the mature buck population would drop down. I don't think you wouldn't see as many, big bucks. And of course, that's not for everybody. That's not how everybody hunts. So there's always two sides to it. But coming from Vermont and seeing where, I just think Massachusetts is so special in the Northeast with the amount of mature buck hunting that is available. It makes it almost like a Midwestern state comparatively, to the rest of the Northeastern states with mature buck populations. So there would, you're going to get a lot of pushback on that if that happens, but you're also going to get probably more people that are excited about the additional access. So
yeah, and that's honestly one of the reasons. I guess one of the things of feedback that we regularly get when we go to these hearings, or especially this hearing where we're doing a lot of things focused on deer management, there's often the question of why can't we just have more bucks? Do bonus buck systems and all of that. Ultimately, bucks don't matter that much when you're talking about actual population growth or decline.
Right.
And by having the restriction at the straight 2-buck limit, that's what really enables us to have a lot of those mature bucks on the landscape, because of the fact that there is that finite number of bucks that can be taken across the entire state in a given year. So even if you have changes to what implements can be used, that cap's not changing for the 2 bucks. And so it's not really going to change much in terms of the top line bucks that are taken, particularly as fill rates of active deer hunters is actually relatively high for bucks across the state. It's really getting the fill rates higher on antlerless permits is where we tend to really need to focus a lot of our attention.
Right. So would there be any, and this would, the crossbow is a statutory thing too, right?
Yep.
And you obviously wouldn't know how that final, if that got passed, what that would even look like in final wording. But for instance, if you wanted to increase, the main goal is getting the population, the deer herd, into a stable number that the ecosystem can support, right?
Absolutely.
So that's killing does by providing new access, and I'm just spitballing, but bringing new access to hunters in these suburban urban zones, these eastern parts of the state. Crossbow being available to shoot does only. Would that be, something that you think would be beneficial? Or because I feel like that could be the best of both worlds, where you're not really changing the way it's been, because again, there's that culture part. Eastern, suburban, urban areas, I think the reason there are good mature bucks is because it's so hard to hunt, which again, it's like, let's try to make more access. Let's make inroads into the communities, do some PR and get some publicity out there and show them why we need to reduce herd numbers. that's part of the reason why I think we have, good hunting.
I think it's important to keep in mind that most legislators here in Massachusetts don't have really any experience with hunting. And so when we're communicating about potential changes,
you want to steer away from trophy hunting being a part of it.
Oh, no. What I'm getting at is that the simpler the message, the better.
Yeah.
And so when we start introducing extra restrictions, extra things that they would have to keep in mind when they're going to have to be supporting these bills, that becomes more of a communication hurdle.
Yeah.
Saying that we're just trying to make it where anyone can use a crossbow, that's a very simplistic message. When you start getting into an antlerless deer, well, what is an antlerless deer? Why are, there's all those questions. If you have no history of hunting, that's a much more complex thing that you have to be able to grapple with. And so whenever we're talking about legislative change, we really try to keep it as simplistic as possible. We can always add regulations on top of that. So let's say the hunting community really was able to advocate for this and legislators were able to change it, but then there was a push or even a biological need to have some of those restrictions. We as an agency can add those regulatory changes on top. But from a statutory perspective, we'd rather things be as open as possible and then allow us then to, as an agency to manage for the public.
Yeah.
The other thing there is ultimately how I view our responsibility as an agency in general in terms of wildlife. We're here to manage and protect a wild good, or a natural resource, being the deer population. And most of the regulations that have restricted hunting and things like Sunday hunting restrictions and on, were all from the idea of trying to protect something that nearly went extinct from market hunting. And now we're in a very different circumstances where it is much more about dealing with overabundant deer populations to try to protect our forests and ecosystems and habitat for other wildlife. And so when possible, when I'm working on regulatory change, I try to get out of the way. How many of these things can we take away? So if folks look at even like the proposed regulation package that's moving forward right now, a lot of it's deletions because we don't want to have these complex regulations that are really hard and not very digestible for new hunters. If we can get out of the way and allow hunters to be able to recreate and be able to recreate how they choose. If someone wants to crossbow hunt, they would potentially be able to. If someone wants to hunt with a shotgun, etc. That's really, in principle, what we'd like to be able to do. Obviously, there's a lot of other minutia that goes in there. That's why the restrictions are in place, but that's really in principle what we try to do with regulations now is try to remove a lot of the restrictions rather than historically where they were placed on.
Yep, that's awesome. And we're going to get into the regulation package probably the second half of the podcast, and we'll talk through all of them with everybody here. And again, we'll tell you guys about the public hearing and how you can be a part of that. Let's talk a little bit. We're talking about deer densities. Can you tell everybody how you determine deer densities in the state? Mm-hmm. Is it by scat piles? Is it by harvest data? Can you just talk through that a little bit?
Yeah, so the primary data collection is from Hunter Harvest, and so we use a population reconstruction model. We get all the harvest data from hunters where they're required to report their harvest within 48 hours. We also get biological and demographic data during the first week of shotgun when every hunter has to bring all their deer into a physical check station. At that point, we get the ages of each one of the deer, as well as we get measurements for antler beam diameter and weights and a whole bunch of other things. And then from that, I essentially take all that, and then we use that for the modeling to be able to get the individual densities of each individual zone. Population reconstruction, essentially you can kind of think of it as rebuilding the population and back from previous years and moving forward. So if a deer is 3.5 years old now, then we know it was actually alive 3 years ago. And so you build up these estimates for each individual population over time. And that's where you can then get a pretty good accurate density estimate for each individual zone. But the limitation there is predominantly with the fact that you are only sampling harvested deer. So you're only getting those densities in areas where hunters are actually being able to harvest deer.
Right.
In those areas that are closed to deer hunting, we know that those densities will be higher because they don't have that harvest-based mortality. And that's where doing other measures come into play. And so we do have several different strategies for doing vegetation monitoring in particular, to be able to look at the actual browse impacts. Because ultimately, a density or a population, the number doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot what matters really is the impact on the actual ecosystem. And so being able to actually get those other measures of actual browse impacts is where it's really more critical, because that's ultimately, from a conservation perspective, what matters anyways.
So how do you do that? Do you and how often are you going out into particular places, or choose where you're going to check on the browse impact?
So there's several different methods that have been used, to both doing regular forest impact surveys where you have biologists go out and actually just essentially walk through sites, be able to look at the measures of damage in a site. There are some of our conservation partners that are using other methods, including 10 tallest, where you essentially have a small site, you look for the actual height of the plants, and from there you can of seedlings, and be able to actually measure out from there. You also have the Oak Sentinel method, which has been adopted by several towns, where you can you actually plant new oak seedlings, and then you have a comparative growth rate between those that are protected with deer exposure and those that are out in the open, and that can help you see those differences and impacts. So there's lots of different methods, and we work with different land trusts and partners across the state on their implementation.
So has Massachusetts done scat analysis, like scat pile, scat counting, things like that? And if so, what maybe are the limitations there?
So the scat counts were something that were used quite a bit, and there are some partners that still use them pretty extensively. There are a lot of limitations, which is why we're trying to kind of steer folks away from them. There's a lot of bias that you introduce with those kinds of analyses. If you find an area that is a bedding site, you're going to have a ton of piles.
Right.
If you find an overwintering area, same thing. You can be in areas with actually really high density, but if you're off trail and you're not in a spot where they happen to spend time, all of a sudden you're going to bias that data pretty
So you'd have to be in like you'd have to make it a real big piece of land that you'd have to cover.
Yeah, and the big thing, it's often overused to a level of sensitivity. So like DCR uses them extensively for some of their properties, where they try to get at densities across tiny little sections of the property that are in adjacent areas. And reality is, you're really, all of that data that you'd get from across an entire property, that all is giving you really one number, not a whole bunch of small numbers on localized density. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the core issues with it, and it's why we certainly are moving away from that as a method. And for a lot of our areas of the state where we really are focused on the density, we're at a point now where the actual number or the amount of impact doesn't necessarily matter, because we know it's above 18 deer per square mile, and we know we're at a point where there's very low forest regeneration because you can visibly see it. Any suburban hunter here in Eastern Mass, when you go out in those forests, you see a lot of bare ground.
Yeah.
And we don't need to be spending the resources on doing another population analysis of those areas. What we need to spend our resources on is how do we get to a point of not having those impacts on the forest. And so that's a much more efficient use of our resources, of staff time, as well as when we communicate with our partners.
So can we talk about Zone 9? Because Zone 9, you guys are seeing an increase in population densities, and that, I'm assuming, is from the harvest data over the last couple of years, and why that zone jumped, 4,000 antler list tags in 1 year?
Yeah, so the increase in permits is just because of the fact that we do our allocations on a 3-year cycle, and so we could be having incremental, each year along the way, but that was the jump from just that point in the cycle. But certainly Zone 9, it's the zone where we are talking a lot about this within this section as the zone where we could potentially pull back so it doesn't become like 10 and 11.
Yeah.
Around Worcester, which makes up kind of the center there of Zone 9, we're seeing all the same restrictions that we see in Zones 10 and 11 around the entire 495 corridor and the Fall River section. And so our focus really right now is on trying to keep that zone and pull it back to more what we see in the rest of the valley. Zone 8 is actually, from an analytical standpoint, kind of the perfect zone. And so if we can pull it back more towards its western neighbor there, we can, really help the ecosystem there in kind of the I think one of the most important regions of the state, because it's one of those areas where you can get real natural habitat in a lot of the state parks throughout Zone 9. And for a lot of the urban communities, that's their first place where they actually get to experience sort of wild habitat.
Yeah.
And we want to be able to make sure that those parks and those natural areas throughout Zone 9 are able to be in really healthy shape there for the long term. And so certainly that's going to be continuing as we move forward here, our focus on trying to just pull that back more towards what we see there in the rest of the Connecticut Valley.
Cool. Yeah, because I hunt both Zone 10 and Zone 9, and for sure, and I don't hunt everywhere in Zone 9, but for sure in Zone 9 I see a lot less deer, a lot less does than in Zone 10. But it makes sense, especially if a lot of Zone 9 is along, that suburban urban area of Worcester, and if that's where the population's really exploding, not in the areas where I'm hunting Zone 9. But again, you can't break every zone into 100 micro zones, right? So
yeah. I mean, and that's certainly one of the most common piece of feedback we get is, well, why can't we split all these zones in all these different ways to be able to address where I'm hunting? But the reality is it's not really effective on an actual landscape management perspective. And certainly when you compare Zone 9 and Zone 10, they're right now not similar at all. Zone 10 is really starting to creep up into pretty high densities. On the low end of densities across Zone 10, you're looking in the mid 30s deer per square mile, and we have many areas across Zone 10 that are going much higher than that.
Yeah.
Whereas in Zone 9, the highest densities you're really looking are going to be right in that 30 range, and we're quite a bit lower than that through much of it. So it's really just trying to pull it back. The hard part with deer management in general is their reproductive capacity makes it where if you fall on the backside, on the back of your feet there a little bit, it can be very hard to catch up. And so it's better to be proactive and try to make sure that we are addressing overabundance issues ahead of time, because once it becomes a problem and once you get to the point in 10 and 11, best case scenario in Zone 10 and 11, if I could throw out every single deer management tool I had in the book, would probably be to flatline the population to make it where we're not having increases. Zone 9, we're still at a point where we can pull that back. And so this is the time to do so before we get to that point where we lose some of that management control.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So ideally, Zone 10 and 11, right, you would like to see a lot more does shot.
Yeah, a lot higher antlerless harvest, higher harvest in general. It's a very tough region to work in, and it's also one where we are facing other impacts too. Zone 11, we're dealing with a lot of farmers who have a lot of damage that they are facing, and it's a hard state to be a farmer. I mean, in general, most farms here in Massachusetts are very small.
Yeah, rocky soils.
Yeah, certainly. And so when you have the ag damage that's going on in Zone 11, it becomes really important. I mean, folks really understand nowadays how important it is to have access to local food. That's one of the great things about hunting is you have access to that local meat source right there that's helping the conservation in your environment. But you also want to be able to have access to local produce and such. And so in Zone 11, where that's a particular problem, it's another aspect of the deer management of how do we address those deer damage impacts on farms.
I know, not everybody has a lot of time to hunt, or to learn how to butcher and prepare the animal after the harvest. And I think one thing that might be an obstacle in reducing all the doe populations, or in Zone 10 and 11, reducing that doe population, get it into a more stable environment is, I would love to have 7-8 deer in my freezer, but I don't have the time to process 7 or 8 deer, and then it can become expensive to, have a professional do it. Have you ever thought about, or is there any talk about some kind of funding or a grant or something that could help, where the state might be able to, help you in the processing of the deer? I know you got the Share the Harvest program, which is great, and but I don't know, it's just interesting. I think a lot of people would go out and shoot 7 or 8 does if there weren't a couple obstacles in their way.
Yes, actually, the Hunter Share the Harvest piece there is really our big focal point there on trying to address processing. There's kind of two pieces there when it comes to processing. There are big limitations. Beyond just the hunter that takes a bunch of deer that just gets tired of it, you also have young hunters, particularly if you're a young adult where you live in an apartment, you may not have a place where you can cut up your own deer.
Exactly.
Certainly, if you're in a suburban community, it's not all that easy to be, sitting outside in the driveway with a deer hanging. And so you have that restriction really on new hunters, which is a big problem. And also for new hunters in general, the skills that you're required for that become a big hurdle. And one of the things when we were developing our Hunters Share the Harvest program, as one of the primary objectives was trying to also help the processing industry. Unlike a lot of other states that have huge deer harvests, I mean, New York's a good example, where several 100,000 deer are harvested each year. They can support many hundreds of processors, large processors that make enough living to be able to be able to do that as a main industry. Here in Massachusetts, we just don't have that much in terms of harvest. We also don't have that much of a livestock operation either in terms of the ag side. And so there aren't that many processors around. And a lot of the processors and butchers that work at them are aging out. I mean, a lot of
the
them,
infrastructure is just not here for that.
Exactly. And so one of the things that we can do with our Hunter Share the Harvest program is create that business, that guaranteed business in many ways for the processors to be able to know that they're going to have, a pretty high number of deer that are going to be coming in directly. We pay all the processors with our venison donation program, and with all that acts as that guaranteed business, so that way other hunters then have access to it. Now, it's certainly, that doesn't address the resource constraints there. I mean, it is still economically expensive for individuals, and we have had discussions about different models for addressing that. We've also even had discussions about, game as a potential access to things like SNAP benefits or stuff like that, because it is actually a food resource that is being utilized, and it's a different means of utilizing some of those other resources. But that is one of the drivers to Share the Harvest, certainly, is to help ensure that we have processors here for the long term.
So if somebody wants to participate in that program, they shoot a doe, what do they do next? Or they shoot a buck?
Yeah. So any deer that hunters want to donate, essentially how it works, we have a growing number of processors. This year we got up to 10 processors. The deer itself just has to come in field dressed, otherwise whole, to each one of those processors. And then the hunter can decide whether they want to donate the entire thing or if they want to donate a portion of it. So for this last season, we had thresholds of 15 pounds and 30 pounds for partial donations. If you donated less than 15 pounds, then you paid for the entire processing, but you could donate as little as a pound. If you donated at least 15 pounds, then we paid $50 of the processing, and then the hunter would then pay the rest. And if they donated at least 30 pounds, then we paid $100 of the processing, and then the hunter would pay the rest. And so if you're a hunter in some of these urban areas where you're taking a lot of deer, and all you really care to have is, just a bunch of back straps.
I was going to say, somebody told me to ask you. They're like, hey, the Share the Harvest program, you donate the whole deer, it gets grinded up. Can we at least get the back straps back? And
absolutely. Yep. And so we have quite a few donors that are doing that, where they're donating 3-4 deer at the 30-pound plus donation threshold, and they're keeping just the cuts they want, and the rest goes to the program. And we are now at a point where the program, in just 2.5 seasons, has now distributed more than 50,000 meals across the Commonwealth. This is real impact. This is no longer a small program for, just a handful of hunters that are interested in being able to donate. We had more than 200 deer already donated from just this last season here in 2024 from across the state. And each year we're seeing really rapid growth.
So where can everybody find the list of processors?
So we have a short link at mass.gov/sharetheharvest. We keep that updated with all the processors, all the information for that, as well as all the distributors, which we now are distributing also to 14 different food banks and organizations and tribes across the Commonwealth.
Awesome. Dude, that's a great program. And that answers whoever that question was about the back straps.
Yeah,
that answers that question.
Absolutely. We'll take as many deer as you want that way.
All right, we're going to go through some questions that people submitted and just kind of change it up a little bit. And I realize we didn't touch on moose yet, but we will. Do you know anything about like the pearling on a buck's antlers and what that may mean? I saw an article going around, I think it was Dr. Deer that shared it, where he said the purling at the base of the antlers. You can see it a little bit on that
Yeah.
buck there, but not so much on that one. That was directly tied into the nutrition available for the deer. Do you know anything about that?
I do not. I mean, certainly. So Dr. Deere is from Texas, and there they spend a lot of time and money on antler development because
Right.
almost all deer harvested in Texas are effectively high fence deer harvests, and they're predominantly almost domestically raised. So it's a different whole structure. They're also feeding deer extensively, but in terms of the actual cause of that, I'm not. Definitely not an expert on antler development.
Yeah, because I mean, you see it between the deer that you harvest. It is every buck is a little bit different. It would be cool if there was a link there.
Yeah, and there's lots and lots and lots of research on antler development, particularly from all those captive facilities, like Oklahoma, Texas. Frankly, if you're interested in antler development, there's entire books just written on those because it's a very interesting field, but it's also a hyper-focused field, really for captive deer industry.
Have you listened to or read any papers from Mississippi states? They do some great research on all kinds of deer.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the researchers actually did a lot of their work up in Michigan on fawn survival and adult survival. For a lot of my PhD work, I replicated a lot of that work that was done in Michigan on survival. Really incredible work that comes out of the Mississippi State Deer Lab. They also are one of the leaders when it comes to communication on chronic wasting disease. They developed a whole series of videos that are being used by states all across the country on how to communicate effectively about chronic wasting disease, prevention, testing, those kinds of things.
Yeah, that must be the most funded, deer research in the country because, I mean, they just put out that's the only thing I ever see on YouTube, for studies. They put out so many studies, GPS collar stuff. Have we ever done any GPS collaring stuff here in Mass?
Not recently. Those studies are kind of difficult in a small state like this in terms of resources, but a lot of the states around us have. I did when I was doing all my doctoral work in New York, and a lot of that stuff is pretty transferable across the states. There are areas of I guess the interest here would be probably on more the urban areas now in Massachusetts where we don't really understand some of the movements. The last telemetry work that was done here in the state was really focused on the Connecticut Valley and western portions of the state, and that was done in the 90s and 2000s. And most of that's not going to change that much just because the habitat hasn't changed that much in those areas, versus the urban areas here in the state are much more likely to have unique impacts. So certainly one of the things that I've thought about doing would be to be able to actually collar deer in some of the areas that are open to hunting around the 495 corridor, and then some on properties that are closed, and actually seeing how they utilize the landscape.
Yeah.
And I think it would be a very effective communication tool to show folks why it's so important to open up even those small little areas to hunting.
Yeah.
Because the deer may only utilize that spot for a very small time, but that's the only access hunters will have to those deer.
Yeah, that would be super interesting to see a study like that. And what kind of, obviously it's probably just funding related.
Yeah, I mean it's funding, it's resource time. There's only one of me in terms of as a deer biologist for the state, and so much of the focus right now has been trying to really update our regulations. We've had a lot of packages recently between the Zone 1 through 9 extension, the package that's going forth now. We have another package that I'm working on that'll be going to the board this spring. And so I'm trying to modernize a lot of the program, and doing projects like that are quite intensive. And some of that, just kind of juggling all the different hats of the job.
What if there's a philanthropist out there listening that wants to donate $1 million to fund a study like this, including hiring the people to do it so it doesn't take as much work off your plate? Is that a possibility?
Certainly. I mean, it wouldn't even take $1 million to do that. But if having a graduate
if you want
student,
to do it for 10 years, maybe it does.
Yeah. I mean, certainly we would be always open to projects like that. We have other projects that are going on. I'm working on a number of projects on tick-borne illnesses with partners out on Martha's Vineyard in particular. And some of those are funded from philanthropic giving, and that's certainly a pathway. If there, some avid deer hunter out there who really wants to support the program, we probably could get a project.
There's
done
some
easily.
wealthy deer hunters out there. I know there is. when you are like in around Worcester and stuff, you said you have to dart moose. Do you guys do you utilize that to do anything else while the deer is down? And tell people about that a little bit.
Yeah, so right now it's predominantly I do blood draws on every single every moose when we have those capture events. The events to actually capture moose are so rare that we really want to utilize them for everything we can. And so
slap a GPS collar on.
So those studies have been done. So actually, our current bear and fur bear biologist, Dave Waddles, he did all that for his PhD work at UMass Amherst. He was part of the Massachusetts Cooperative Research Unit, and every time that there were those LART events when he was a PhD student, they were doing that, adding collars and stuff. But the expenses add up quickly. So like when we're talking a typical collar. And the actual fees for the GPS updates,
data and stuff, yeah,
you're generally in about the $3,000 to $5,000 each for each individual one, and then you also have all the capture costs and everything else associated with it. And so it's more a weighing of how much data you're going to actually get out of it, where it's effective. So like in the moose case, we're only handling on average about a half a dozen moose a year, and with those, it's also important to keep in mind that it's a pretty biased sample. The moose that we're handling are ones that are already moving into urban areas or acting funny in the first place. That is why we are actually capturing them.
Yep.
And a lot of them have other health impacts going on. It's why we also see that with the blood work, we've been able to see really high rates of brainworm in those moose, which makes sense because that's really why they're deviating from their normal habitat. They're deviating from their normal behaviors is because they have other impacts going on. So it wouldn't be all that effective to use those as a primary sampling tool because they're not your average moose.
How does a moose get brainworm?
So they actually contracted mostly from white-tailed deer. So white-tailed deer are a host for P. tenuis, the meningeal worm that causes those issues in moose, and it doesn't really impact white-tailed deer. It's very pervasive in the environment, and across the country you see this sort of restrictive impact where you have high deer densities that's going to knock down the moose population because of the high mortality rates with brainworm. And so you really don't have areas of high moose density with high deer density, with only a handful of exceptions because of those issues where white-tailed deer effectively are killing moose inadvertently from the brainworm.
Are you aware of like Maine and you know what their population? I mean, they've got the best moose population in Northeast here, and that cause and effect between the deer and the moose up there? Is it the same thing, or the deer giving those moose brainworms?
Yeah, you certainly see it in southern Maine. What really changes in Maine is the very high prevalence of winter tick, and winter tick mortalities are now the predominant cause of mortality in Maine, New Hampshire, Quebec, and several of the other southeastern Canadian provinces, and that's a much higher mortality rate than you even get from brainworm. And winter tick, it is truly one of the most devastating inflictions that you see in wildlife. When moose are dying from it, they typically have over 100,000 winter ticks on them. It is a just brutal way to go. And we see it here in Massachusetts too.
Are they dying from blood loss, or what are they dying from?
So yeah, it's predominantly from the blood loss. You also, they lose most of their hair, so you have hypothermia issues. It causes really kind of full organ failure. And it's just disastrous. And like we've had years where you see really bad impacts with it. 2 years ago, we had a lot of winter tick mortalities reported to us that spring 2023. I dealt with a couple of capture cases. We had one in Westford where the moose had essentially lost 2/3 of its hair from the winter tick. It was barely able to get up even from when we got there, and wasn't able to actually recover from those injuries. And it's just a brutal way to go, and it's a really tough thing because essentially all these northeastern states had managed for high moose densities for a very long time, because it was great for hunters. I mean, it was a case where it was relatively easy to get a moose tag compared to at least historic limitations. And so states really started to focus on trying to grow those moose populations. But winter tick is density dependent. And so the more moose you have in an area, the more you're going to have spread. And you're sort of trapped with this decision. Do you try to reduce the moose population via hunter harvest? At least then it's being utilized, that resource. Or do you let them die from winter tick, from overabundant moose and causing overabundant ticks? And then it's a brutal way to die. And so that's the really tough balance. And moose in management with this is really tough. It's Lee Cantor, the moose biologist in Maine, is in many ways kind of the godfather of moose management here in the Northeast. And Lee is absolutely incredible at being able to communicate a lot of this effectively to the public, but also Lee is someone who we all look up to as to the amount of research that he has overseen and the changes in management there in Maine. And it's just it's a tough thing. And being at the southern edge of the moose range, we're sort of dealing with this, both the brainworm and the winter tick situation. Further westward in New York, they're not dealing with as much winter tick mortality, but their moose densities are much lower. Their moose densities are even lower than we have here in Massachusetts, and they're dealing with other things like liver flukes causing issue. Moose are a tough species in general to manage, and a lot of it being health-related issues.
But the winter tick is basically all related to the density, right?
Yeah, it's almost exclusively density dependent.
So let's talk about a little bit about that, the moose population here. How do you, because there's no harvest data, how are you guys estimating the population for moose, and what have you seen through those estimations in the past few years and any kind of trends?
So it's been a long time since there's been a true moose estimate, and even then it was loosely done. In general, how we are tracking it is really two ways. One, tracking the vehicle collisions with moose each year. So at the end of every January, I get an export from the environmental police of moose collision data, and we track that over time as an index of the population. And then also we have do regular sighting from the hunter harvest survey. So every hunter, or not every hunter, but we sample a subset of hunters each year that get our annual hunter survey that goes out usually at the end of January. It's going out, I think, this week. And some of the questions that are on there get at how many moose you've seen based on the number of hours and such that you've been hunting. And from that, you can essentially get at a good index there on the amount of moose on the landscape. It is certainly one of the species that we know the least about. And part of that is because we are statutorily limited to even do a moose hunt. That's another one of the things, along with the crossbow hunting and Sundays hunting and all the others, that the legislature has banned moose hunting in Massachusetts. And so with that, we are restricted as to how we can even use our federal resources because we can't have an actual harvest on them. And so effectively, we say that there's somewhere between 800 and 1,000 moose. Could there be lower than that, in the 600 range? Certainly. Could it be above 1,000? Certainly, but it's likely to be in that 800 to 1,000 range. And we don't have enough data to really watch trends over like small changes. However, we do see trends when it comes to things like the large animal responses. And after that 2023 spring where we had a lot of winter tick mortalities, we've essentially seen everything go quiet on moose. This last year, there were only a couple of moose captures done. Moose collisions were way down. So it's clear that mortality that occurred in that winter 2022 into 2023 definitely had an impact on the population.
How many mortalities were there, do you know? Or the ones that were reported?
Yeah, so in terms of reports, we had over 36 reports of individual moose that year. And several of those, I think we had 5 cases where we actually handled those moose as well. So it was, and that's only going to be, kind of tip of the iceberg of that event. So
in relation to previous years, what you maybe get 5 or 10 reports, or how many?
Yeah, that's going to be more in the handful of cases each year. So it was a particularly high number, and there were a lot of stressors going into that. We also had the record drought that summer too, and we were dealing with a lot of cases of moose coming into people's pools and coming into cow pastures to the water that farmers are putting out. A lot of those cases because they just were so desperate, and once they found those water resources, they wouldn't leave. So we were having to deal with hazing cases and things like that because it was a particular challenge with them.
Yeah, so we answered one of the questions. Somebody asked, what would be the measures needed to be taken to start a moose hunt here? So that'll be a statutory thing. Do you know when that legislation was introduced that banned it?
Several decades ago. I mean, I think even pre-1970s.
And why? Was it because the population was very low? Was it a public perception thing? I don't know, but
I don't
know. All right, so we'll go down a few more of these questions here. Habitat management. I know you said you don't handle that in MassWildlife, but some of the general questions are around, do you know if what the state does for habitat management for deer and moose in terms of cutting or controlled burns, things like that?
Yeah, so on that end, when we have a whole habitat team that essentially evaluates the needs for all of our different species that we all manage under, and they're the ones who also handle things like burns and cutting, and deer are always something that's brought up when we're talking about management, particularly in the Connecticut Valley. In those areas, the primary limitation to actually the growth of the deer population is actually closed canopy. And so when you have the cuts that our agency does on a lot of the WMAs, a lot of that is focused on both deer habitat, but also like New England cottontail and other species that really need that early successional new growth to be occurring. And the moose, certainly, we are not managing necessarily for moose in mind with those, but every time you have a new cutting, that moose just they flock to those areas.
And that area are we seeing a below the carrying capacity density for deer in those areas with the old growth forests?
Yeah, I mean, in those areas, if depending on how much hunting activity is around, a lot of those properties you have relatively low densities. I mean, it's not uncommon to see areas that are probably in the 10 to 12 deer per square mile range, if you're in areas that are just pure closed canopy. But also naturally, closed canopy will always support fewer deer because deer are naturally an edge species. And what they're really adapted for is those areas where you have new cuts or traditionally new fire lines, those kinds of things, where they would eat a lot of the young seedlings and young bushes and all that new growth that pops up right out on those edges of forests, or where you'd have a knockdown event where a mature tree would fall and all the young growth that would come up from underneath that. That's really what their evolutionary advantage is for, and where their diet sort of excels the most with nutrition. And that's nowadays, with such a push towards preservation of forest rather than management of forest, you do lose a lot of that really important early successional habitat. And that's not just for deer, that's for a whole host of species that traditionally needed that early successional forest.
Yeah, nesting birds and
absolutely
rabbits and
yep.
Do you have an estimate on what our state's buck to doe ratio looks like?
No, we actually haven't done much analysis on the actual top line sex ratio, just because that requires doing pretty extensive camera surveys. It also would change some of the management that we do, and frankly, we don't have many complaints on the sex ratio, as you've already highlighted. A lot of our hunters are very happy with how things are here in terms of buck harvest, and so it's less of a necessity. Certainly, if we were in an alternative scenario where we were having a lot of complaints on that's where we would then be an area of focus. But since that's not what our constituents are really having issues with, that's just not a high focus.
Yeah. And then something we talked about earlier, again, just how zone 10 and 11 could get out of control. That's what you're trying to do in zone 9 is preemptively stop it from becoming a zone 10, 11 situation where there's too many deer. Part of that is because the average doe, do you know if the average doe in Massachusetts is giving birth to fawns, or is the average doe here, 1.5 deer that they're birthing? Do you know anything about that, or have any estimates?
Yes, we do track some of the reproductive rates, and they vary a bit depending on the zone, but we're seeing anywhere from about 1.3 fawns per doe per year, upwards of 1.7, depending on the region. we have the highest reproductive rates really in southeastern Mass, where they don't have the overwintering stress. At this point, we don't really see winter mortality occurring anywhere in the state because our winters are just not harsh enough, long enough in terms of snowpack. But what we do see is a decline in some of those fawn ratios, where it is going to be much closer to that 1.3, 1.4 range, which is another one of those things kind of keeping those populations right at a healthy level versus southeastern Mass, where we're seeing those high fawn ratios. The other thing that we're seeing on a reproductive end is a shift, or I guess a more flexible birth peak, where historically when you'd have the harsh winters that were found here in New England through most of the last century, that really put a lot of pressure evolutionarily on a short birth peak. And then what has changed here over time, with having such mild winters, we're seeing more does that don't get pregnant on their first ovulation cycle or don't get pregnant even on their second or third.
Even right now, there's still some does getting pregnant.
Absolutely. So we're seeing that cycling occurring so late because of the fact that they just don't have harsh winters. And so that's where you really start to bump up those reproductive rates, not just the actual fawns per doe, but also just the actual overall production of fawns, because you have does that would normally not be having any that are going to be also producing.
What are contributing factors, you think, to the birth rate in terms of being 1.3 or 1.7 or 2? What contributes to that? What would make a doe have triplets?
Yeah, I mean, the primary things there are going to be high nutrition and then going to be lack of winter stress, because that's one of the most incredible reproductive traits that deer have, is that they can actually reabsorb their fetuses. And a lot of my PhD work in New York actually focused on reproductive ecology, both fawn survival, on fetal growth, and a lot of these issues exactly. And so we could actually look at these things of reabsorbed fetuses. And it's such an incredible trait that essentially if does in the winter are really food stressed, their body will naturally reabsorb a fetus because the evolutionary advantage is on it surviving into another reproductive cycle, because it can have 2 more fawns that next winter.
That's cool.
So, and if you think about winters in general, because of cycles that occur like El Nino and other just regular cycles you have across time, every winter you may have a really harsh winter where you aren't going to be able to handle being able to actually produce triplets. So then why put your body through it? Even if you actually had 3 eggs get fertilized, the body will reabsorb the ones that
Does it do it one at a time?
Yeah, so you'll end up with these sort of like mummified fetuses that actually go into the uterine wall, and it'll actually absorb almost all the nutrients back into the body, so that way that doe can survive and may only have 1 or 2 fawns then be born that coming spring, survives to that next winter, much milder winter, and then is able to have a full set. And so it is such an incredible strategy be able to produce a lot of fawns. And that's one of those things that we see that in terms of limitations. Now that we don't really have very many harsh winters, really the limitations we're seeing across the state are the nutrition levels from closed canopy in some of the valley areas and the higher elevation areas, and then also the fact they do have more food stress during that winter because harsher winter, colder, and then also very little ground vegetation in a lot of those closed canopy areas.
Well, the evolution's pretty crazy how they can just absorb. If they have triplets in their uterus, and they don't want to give up all 3 of them, they can absorb them one at a time until they have the right amount of nutrition. That's really cool.
Yeah, and they also can get pregnant from multiple bucks in a given season.
Yeah,
too.
I just heard that too. I think from Mississippi Deer Labs.
Yep, yeah, and we did the same work. So of my work in New York, we actually did genetics on about 1,400 deer throughout this entire population at Fort Drum, and with that, we were able to actually get at the rates of multiple paternity within an individual set of twins. So if they have eggs that drop at different times within each uterine horn, each of those can be fertilized by a different buck. And so, most hunters tend to think of the rut's going to be one time, and when they're going to be tending, that's it. And the reality is these does can actually get pregnant at multiple times throughout that season, just based on their ovulation cycles.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's awesome. In southeastern Massachusetts, where we have so much overpopulation, right? We're above what the carrying capacity can be. It seems a little bit counterintuitive that maybe the driving force of the birth rate for does is more on that, winter survivability, because in those areas where it's so overpopulated, you would think the nutrition is much lower. They have less access to nutrition, so that they wouldn't be having as many fawns.
Well, it's a little counterintuitive, but actually deer do really, really well in suburbia. And then also what you have in Southeast too is all of the ag production. But in suburbia in general, suburbs grow big deer. And that's because you've got all this really high nutrition vegetation that people are knowingly plant.
Yeah.
Regular plants that are native, frankly, they are co-evolved with browsing species like deer, so they have a lot of mechanisms up to defend themselves, and also they're used to harsh winters and all that, and so they don't need supplemental nitrogen and fertilizer like all of the domesticated landscaping plants. But all these landscaping plants are getting all that extra nutrition. So all that nutrition you're putting into growing these plants with fertilizers and all that food, well, then deer are also getting that on the flip side when they're actually browsing those. So those suburban areas, they're getting kind of the best of all worlds. They're getting great food from all of the plants that people are growing. They're getting lower predation because the predators themselves are more risk adverse in those areas. There's still plenty of coyotes and things like that going throughout the suburban communities, but they get a bit of an urban shield effect where they're just more vigilant because they don't want to go right by people.
And they might be feeding on pets more too.
Yeah. And then you also have the impact of agriculture as well. And so a lot of those areas, part of the reason why you're seeing such high reproductive rates and fawning rates is because of that. They get that heavy nutrition.
So in areas like that, then would it be fair to say the carrying capacity is higher? Maybe the situation isn't so dire that the nutrition is getting depleted, the ecosystem. So that's what it just seems a little counterintuitive in my mind as we talk through it.
Yeah, I mean, in general, when we talk about whitetail deer management nowadays, carrying capacity is less of an issue just because there's so much more resources available. And so what we really are dealing with more is a social carrying capacity of what people are willing to put up with. The deer populations here, frankly, could continue to rise indefinitely, but eventually the public is going to have a lot of outcry because of the amount of deer collisions, all of those impacts. The whole kind of carrying capacity issues around deer were really focused more on southwestern deer, where you saw these resource restrictions. And nowadays, with having the milder winters, we don't have those issues. And so that's something we really see across all the Northeast now, is where these populations, if there is restrictions on hunting, you really see the populations continue to rise. Some limitations to that, particularly the very northernmost sections of Maine, where they do have some winter mortality occurring, there they do see carrying capacities hit. But that's just not as much of what we're dealing with here. Here it's so much more of the social carrying capacity.
Are you aware of, or what do you think the effect is on a buck in an area where there's a lot of does, or a whole buck group, a whole bachelor group, where there's a ton of does? Their bodies are under a lot more stress. The rut's going to be a lot more of an extended period of time. They're going to be really going 100% balls to the wall, for a lack of a better term, for longer. What does that do to them?
Yeah, so, I mean, there's a couple things that are going out there. When you have a very high number of does and that ratio gets skewed in that direction, it reduces the amount that the bucks will be moving because they're not going to have to actually go find other does, since there's going to be a lot of does available. What it also does is create kind of a pocket where individual bucks can end up breeding where they wouldn't necessarily. You tend to see a lot more like buck fawns actually be able to inseminate, particularly with genetic studies. You'll pop up that way because there's going to be less competition between bucks. There's less, in general, conflict. So actually, in terms of their physiology, those situations, this is another one where it's sort of flipped to the way you'd think of this intuitively, because in those situations, everything's so easy because they can just keep going doe to doe to doe, that they're not having to have as much stress as where if you have a case of where there's far fewer does and the bucks are having to have a lot more of that conflict, most mortality that occurs for bucks during the rut other than hunter-harvest mortality, is going to be from bucks actually fighting one another. And you're going to have much more pressure between bucks to actually fight one another when the resource is scarce.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's where you actually see a lot of the conflict, a lot of mortalities is where you have those lower doe ratios. And the other thing, though, is that hunting is also much tougher in areas where the ratio is a lot of does to lower bucks, because the bucks aren't having to move around. They're not having to do that competition. When they're having to do that competition, that makes it where, all their mind on is finding that next doe. If all they have to do is walk to the next field and they've got another doe that's ovulating, they're not going to go anywhere else. They're going to go to that next field. And so it's one of the reasons why.
So they're actually less stressed when there's a lot more does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is one of the reasons also why there's a big focus on antlerless harvest across the entire Northeast and really nationally. The National Deer Association has done a lot of work on this, on promoting folks taking more does, because that really helps in terms of harvest in general, helps in terms of the health of the population and all these overabundant issues. But it also makes it much more effective to find some of those bigger bucks, because they actually have to work for it.
Yeah.
And you got a lot of does around, they're not having to work for it.
Yeah, it might turn on a more energized rut,
Yeah.
rut experience. Yeah, because there's one spot that I hunt in Zone 10. This year I saw 20 different does from the tree stand that day. They were in different groups. There was an 8 and 8, and I know they were different because I literally saw the last one, and this train of 8 going that way, and then here came another 8 coming down, and there was at least 20 different does in that group. And in that area, there's quite a few bucks as well. I saw tons of deer. I wouldn't say that in that particular case it's made it harder, because I had a lot of deer within range, but I passed a lot of them. But what I noticed, now that you bring that up, is I've never seen a full-on, all-out brawl between bucks there, but I see them kind of socially just they're more just sparring and tinkling. But I've never seen an all-out brawl there where I have in some of those other places where there's less does. So that makes sense.
Yeah, because there you have a scarce resource, and now it's worth fighting for.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. But some guys were like, dude, you got to shoot a lot of does out of there because those bucks are going to be stressed for so long. They're running themselves thin. I want to shoot does anyway, but I was thinking, yeah, that makes sense. The bucks here, from what I'm noticing, antler wise, there's some good average bucks in there, but I haven't seen, giant, 150, 160 absolute giant bucks in that area. And I was thinking, well, maybe it's because there's so many does and they're stressed all the time by going back, chasing them for 3 months. But, it's food for thought the way that you're explaining it.
The other thing that happens there too, when you have a lot of does available, is the bucks can be a lot choosier on how much they're going to put up with hunting activity. So if you're in an area where the bucks can more or less ignore the day side and really become highly nocturnal, which, a lot of hunters see that on their trail cameras, where the second that season begins, all of a sudden, bucks are getting active at like midnight, being inaccessible. That's part of that. It's, again, that limited resource. If you harvest more antlerless deer, where now that buck's got to work to find ovulating doe, it's going to draw them out even in times that they don't want to be out, because they've got to get that limited resource.
Yeah,
but if
that's a good point too.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's all about trying to, try to address those sex ratios. That's why increasing antlerless harvest is frankly a very effective tool at being able to get a lot of those off limits bucks.
Do you know anything about bucks shedding their antlers, and is there a time? Does that coincide with their testosterone levels dropping? Are there other factors that may contribute to that? Injury, if they got hit by a car, or they were shot by a hunter earlier in the season, or real cold snaps. Is there anything like that contributes to when a buck will shed his antlers?
Yes, there's a lot of factors in there. So testosterone's one, and their bodies will essentially continue to generate a lot of testosterone as long as they're still having a lot of really the reproduction with deer. And so as they're finding does that are still ovulating, you'll see bucks carry a lot later, because they're getting more of that kind of re-energizing hit to then trigger more testosterone generation. You also, certainly, like injuries to the pedicel and the velvet early on can make it where they're less likely to stay on long term. also just regular genetic variations from buck to buck. There's also going to be differences in terms of the age too. So younger bucks will often drop a little bit earlier, partially because they're going to be less effective at being able to actually copulate with females. So then they're not going to get that testosterone
They're
hit.
going to give up earlier.
Exactly. So there's all those things going into it. Reproduction is another factor there. It's resource intensive going through the rut, and so in that case, the reproduction is actually, or the impact on nutrition. What that's actually doing is reducing their ability to copulate and be able to be effective at fighting again, reducing the testosterone hit. So it varies a little bit, but then there are also those really abnormal cases where we'll find bucks that are still carrying into April and in very rare cases even May. But there's just always those variations. When you're talking about a species where there are literally millions on the landscape across North America, and here in Massachusetts, well over 100,000, you're going to have lots of room for weird cases.
Yeah. Awesome. So we are going to get into the regulations in a few minutes here on the proposed regulations. But I want to talk about your CWD research, what we're doing in the state of Massachusetts to prevent the spread of CWD. But first, for everybody, can you just give a layman's, don't use your scientific words because many of us aren't going to understand it, but use your layman's terms. What is CWD and why is it a threat to deer populations everywhere?
Yeah, so CWD, or chronic wasting disease, is a prion disease, which means that it's actually spread from misfolded proteins. And there's a whole series of prion diseases that are the long form called transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. And all those diseases are spread by these misfolded proteins. The most commonly known ones that people are most familiar with are mad cow disease. And so there's certainly the public fear around a situation like that, mad cow that was able to cross from cows to humans. The good thing here is that there has so far never been a case of a deer spreading chronic wasting disease to a human. Certainly many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of deer that have been positive have been ingested by hunters across North America over the last few decades. But the big concern is really the impact on the deer themselves. So with CWD, it is always fatal for deer in the long term. So generally speaking, it takes about 18 months to 24 months before they start having any clinical signs. And then they're going to die at about 2.5 to 3 years old, 3 years later from the CWD. But that entire time, they're spreading those prions into the environment. And the other thing here that makes prions in particular so unique compared to like bacteria or viruses is that you effectively can't get rid of prions. Once they're in the environment, if deer gets access to that 15, 20 years later and picks up that prion, they can then actually get positive. It's not something that goes away after a short period of time.
What's the half-life, do you know?
So that doesn't even play here. Yeah. So it's literally just a tissue. So that's why it can be many decades. The reason why it's always put at about 15 years is because there have been facilities with captive deer where they've depopulated the entire herd, brought on deer that were known to be negative, and then had them turn positive. And so it's very clear that you can have that, and it's why, from a management perspective, once an area has had CWD, it is always considered to be positive from that point forward because those prions are going to be in the environment. Things like bleach doesn't work on prions, fire. So like it's just a very difficult set of diseases to manage for. And really the impact on a population standpoint and like from a hunting perspective, when you end up with CWD in an area, you pretty much say goodbye to any mature bucks because bucks transmit CWD much more readily between them because of the fact that they have much more contact. They can go over larger distances, so they're going to be exposed to more deer. You have all that contact amongst different family groups that bucks have during reproduction. And in general, they're also just much more high contact. And with that, with them being more likely to spread amongst each other, that also makes it where they're going to get it sooner. And then after the 2.5, 3 years, they're going to die. So those, incredible trophy bucks that are at that like 6, 7-year-old stage, you really lose them altogether in high CWD zones. And so that's really one of the major losses there because of that. It's also just a really rough way to go. You see a lot of the deer in areas that have a lot of clinical deer where you'll see the deer sort of wasting away. They're called transmissible spongiform encephalopathies because of the fact that the brain actually becomes like a sponge. You see holes in all the neural tissue. and that leads to them having really bad behavior. They'll circle. You'll have more conflicts than coming up to people. They're confused. A lot of those things all come with that.
So obviously we don't want that here. And before the podcast, we were talking about, the Northeast here is one of the last
it's really
frontiers for it not being here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the last region left across North America where our hunters aren't having to worry about it. It's essentially, you have New York, where they've had it in captive deer, including a new facility in October that we can talk a bit about, but also Quebec, where they had it at a captive deer facility. But other than that, from this whole section from Ontario eastward and all of New England, this is the last section of the continent left where our hunters aren't having to worry about it. After new cases that were recently detected in California and Washington State and the Southeast with Florida, the map has really filled in here over the last 5 years. And so it's sort of an incredible opportunity and valuable thing that we have, that our hunters don't even have to debate as to whether they're going to, feed their family, their deer because of CWD. They're not having to worry about whether or not to get it tested, all the restrictions that come with that. We talk about this a lot in terms of our Share the Harvest program. We just got that going, and it's working so well. And if we had CWD, all of a sudden we're going to have to think about how we logistically handle that, how you're going to test the deer before actually distributing it. All those things become really complicated. And so we spend a lot of time on prevention, and that's really been a big focus of my job over the last essentially 3 years. In 2022 and in 2023, we disseminated a survey that went out to more than 20,000 hunters across the state. We were able to use that to gauge hunters' knowledge, their opinions, perceptions around chronic wasting disease, their behaviors, where they've hunted throughout the country. Have they had deer that have been tested? Have they even turned positive? Use that to actually understand how many deer that were positive likely have come back into Massachusetts. And then from all the knowledge information, we've been able to use that to really target education around CWD. We've added a new page that's in the hunting and fishing guide that folks can get, that goes through all of the up-to-date information on CWD and management, how to keep mass CWD free. We have new brochures that are available. We have new website. We have new bookmarks. We instituted statewide testing 2 years ago, and we've continued that this last season. So it's really been a very holistic approach. Then going into our last project, we worked with our collaborators at the UMass Cooperative Research, the Massachusetts Cooperative Research Unit, to actually go through a formal structured decision-making process. So SDM is a method of really dealing with complex problems. And as I've already highlighted, CWD is a pretty complex disease to manage. And there's all these social implications with it. There's management implications. And so the SDM process allows us to take all that information and think about what's really important to our constituents. For our hunters, that's certainly being able to maximize the actual harvest, maximize the resource itself. For our non-consumptive users, being able to see deer, be able to know that they're a healthy herd. From an agency perspective, doing it efficient from a cost perspective, all these things. And then we look at different alternative actions that we can take and then see how those would perform if you had different times that the disease would actually arrive, whether it arrives here in the next 2 years or if it doesn't arrive in the next 10 years. And each of those things then would have a different sort of cost benefit. Certainly if it never arrives, then any action we take is sort of a wasted action because it didn't arrive. But if it arrives quickly and we weren't doing anything about it, that's going to have negative implications for the agency. And so with that, we were able to kind of look forward as to what we would like to be able to do to optimize our management of chronic wasting disease. So that's included new regulations that are a part of the pending package. It's included the surveillance that we've started. So this last season, we had 390 deer during the biological deer check week that were surveyed across the entire state. It includes adding new materials, some of the educational materials, and then also being able to work with some of our regional partners on instituting testing here in New England. Because one of the other things that we've faced that we struggle with is the fact that since we haven't had those positives here in New England, we are sort of on the back of the priority list for a lot of the labs that can do the CWD testing. And so bringing some of the testing here, so that way if there is a positive, we're able to quickly adapt and get those tests in and out, becomes really important.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, but one of the main things, right, for us to prevent it is not importing deer from states where it is prevalent, right, and harvests and whatnot. So what are the things right now that, let's say a hunter's going to Iowa, he wants to bring the deer back, what does he have to do?
Yeah, so no matter what, under current regulation, if you are hunting in a state that has ever had a detection, then you must debone all of the deer before bringing it into Massachusetts. So as long as it's deboned, what that's essentially doing is removing most of the risk, because the highest concentrations of the prions are in neural tissue. It doesn't eliminate all of it. Some of that's going to be muscle, but also the muscle is what people are utilizing.
Eating,
yeah. And so we're not going to try to restrict folks from bringing in this resource that they use. Ultimately, this is feeding people's families. It's a very important part of the food system.
Yeah.
But for the other portions that aren't being utilized for food, those are, if we can remove that risk from our wild population before it comes here, that's what it's designed to do with the current regulation. We do have a pending regulation that would expand that to all states outside of New England. One of the things that we have here is that within New England, we all know what each other does. We work together on a lot of work because of our close proximity. And so it's easier for us to understand those risks of lack of surveillance or all of those aspects. And what we've really seen across the country with how rapidly states have had their first detections, we don't want to put our wild herd at risk to the differences in surveillance that's going on in other portions of the country. And so that's one aspect that certainly comes into play. The other thing in terms of that hunter that'd be going out to Iowa or Pennsylvania or any of the other positive states, it's really critical that they read up on what the actual requirements are in that given state. Some states will have mandatory testing requirements. Some states won't. Some states will have restrictions on where you're going to actually dispose of that deer, whether that be you actually have to bring it to a disposal location or you have to leave it at site and bury it. There's different aspects to that. And while some of the things may seem like they're too much of a challenge and you just want to deal with the headache, there's really important reasons why each of these are done. Even within a state like Pennsylvania, one small state that's not terribly big has actually different restrictions depending on where you are in the state. And all of that is about trying to prevent that disease spread. And so that's one of the best things you can do, both to prevent the spread in other states and thereby also prevent it from coming here into Massachusetts.
All right, and then let's talk about the captive deer facilities, and because that, I mean, that's a breeding ground for it sometimes, right? And that's one of the biggest risks to it getting into the natural population is a deer either escaping a fence or, like you said earlier, just nose to nose, touching or whatever through the fence with a wild deer population. One thing I didn't know was, I asked you how many captive cervid facilities we have in Massachusetts. What is there, 8 of them?
Yeah, we have 8 left in Massachusetts. All but 3 of them are already on sunset provisions, which essentially means that they can only keep the deer that they currently have. They can't have new deer after that.
And the 3 that are not on sunset provisions now, what's the reason for that?
They haven't chosen to go that route yet. We do have one of the other pending regulations as part of this package would be to sunset those. We've already gone through this process before with whitetail deer. So whitetail deer had a sunset provision that was put in 2008. And so at that point, any facility that had whitetail deer they could keep the ones they had, but they couldn't have any additional. And then we have other facilities that have other species where at the time when those regulations were passed in the 2000s, it wasn't understood about those risks. Perfect example of this is red deer. One of the facilities that we have left that
I was going to ask about zoos. Is a zoo count?
So we work very closely with zoos, and actually the accredited zoos do a fantastic job of working with us to even understand current framework. They don't bring in other cervids without permission, and we actually work closely on understanding where those animals came from. The only ones that have actually been brought in recently to any accredited zoo have all been muntjac, and all of those have been from facilities where we know exactly where they were. accredited zoos also require double fencing and a lot of those disease prevention tools. But like the red deer as a perfect example where that was exempted from some of the regulations in the 2000s because at the time it wasn't understood that there was risks there. That actually is the exact case of the species that had detections here in New York in October. And so in October, there was a facility in Columbia, New York, bringing CWD for the first time within 100 miles of our border. Actually, it's just under 90 miles from our border. And that facility first had a single positive red deer after doing a depopulation as part of that. They've now had 3 additional ones that have been positive. And the actions around there really show why it's so critical that we do what we can to prevent CWD from entering here. The state of New York.
That's pretty close to Massachusetts.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we are now within one long distance of buck dispersal of CWD getting here in Massachusetts because of that facility.
Yeah, well, because that buck could, they've been known they can go 20 miles, right, on a dispersal.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And well, that's
and then average. He could pass it, and then that could, the chain reaction.
Yeah, there have been several studies that have shown like the true long distance dispersals where you'll have these rare ones will end up well over 100 miles.
Yeah.
I had one from the facility at Fort Drum that went over 110 miles and kept going. And so we're well within now those long distance dispersals of that bucks make. And
so there's even long distance dispersals when there's not a harsh winter forcing that.
Yep. Yes. Yeah. So that I always kind of compare with long distance dispersal. If you think of the entire globe, we've had all the flotillas where people would literally just go out and you never know if you're going to actually survive, and some would randomly end up on an island and you'd populate. We see this with mountain lions actually as the best example. The mountain lions that have come to the Northeast, those are all coming from North Dakota.
Yep.
Those are males that just get biologically set on, I'm going, and they just go.
Travel in that 90 corridor, right, all the way through.
And that's exactly what we see here with deer. And so it's not common. That's going to be that 1%. But as we said earlier, when you got an animal that has 100,000 plus on the landscape in just our state, you're going to have those 1 or 2 bucks that go long distances, and that's the risk here with that facility now within that 90-mile range. And it really highlights why it's so critical that we address CWD now. There's not the need for the captive deer facilities at this point. It's all the facilities have had declining numbers of deer for a long time, and at this point, it's not worth risking our wild herd for three permittees that aren't on sunset provisions. And it's important to note the entire driver of CWD across North America, the spread and even the origination, is with captive facilities. So the first case was actually described at a captive facility in Colorado. And that facility, and that was in the 1940s and 50s. And those deer were then moved from facility to facility over the coming decades. And it really wasn't understood that this was the driver until the 1990s. By then, it was too late. You'd see that every place you had a lot of captive deer facilities around the continent would have really large outbreaks within their wild populations. And here in the Northeast, the biggest producer of captive deer is Pennsylvania, which is also where you have the massive issues there. And all of that is because of the captive cervid industry. And so doing what we can to prevent those impacts is really critical, because our wild herd, that is our responsibility.
Yeah.
It is that public resource that is our responsibility to manage for, and that's what we are doing in terms of those regulation changes.
Yeah, the preventative approach is way better than having to deal with it after. I mean,
absolutely.
So you guys are doing a great job with that. Are you aware of what New York is doing after that, after those positive cases 80-something miles from our border? Are they trying to kill some surrounding deer as a preventative measure than the wild population there?
Yeah, and so that's actually one of the other impacts here with CWD is once you have detections, the best tool is to reduce the deer population.
Because you're not aware if there was one that escaped.
Exactly.
The facility might not be truthful about that for whatever reason, but you don't know if they escaped, but plus you don't know if they had interaction with a wild animal.
Exactly. And you can have, this was a facility was a single fenced operation, just like the facilities here in Massachusetts. That's sort of the norm, but the problem is that creates the ability to have that contact right at the fence line. And yeah, so what they've had to do is do both depopulations of the facility itself, so all of the deer that were within the facility, depopulations of the deer within a 2-mile area around the facility, and then also really intensively increase harvest and the testing of those of deer within that vicinity. And that it's also just a huge expense. So they've had to do indemnification of the facility itself, which is a big cost there to New York State. And in general, this is why it's so critical that we do what we can to prevent chronic wasting disease here in the state, because we're a much smaller agency. To be able to do what New York did would be nearly impossible from us. But the difference between one facility there and one facility here would be the same. We just don't have the resources to address it. They have the resources from 10 times as many license holders as we have. And also, I think there would be a much tougher environment here in Massachusetts in terms of the social implications. I think we could face a lot of folks who that are already not necessarily comfortable with hunting, that might view this as another tool to reduce access for hunting in the state. And so doing what we can for prevention is really just so critical.
So do you know if they get results back quickly? Does it take a long time? All the harvest they had around that facility, where they increased harvest numbers and tested them, do we know if they came back as negative, or were there any positives in there? Or what can you share about that?
Yes, so far those have all been negative, and the ones outside the facility, and they're going to continue doing testing as they're doing more depopulation there around the facility. But the benefit they have is an absolutely phenomenal organization in the Animal Health Diagnostic Center at Cornell University. And we actually, as part of the Zoonotic Disease Initiative, are actually consulting with them as a subcontractor on that project, because their wildlife health program is really the model for the Northeast. And the AHDC has all the lab testing. They're who we are handling our CWD testing through as well. And so with that, they're able to do very rapid testing to keep up with that as they're doing more work through the winter.
Awesome. I want to talk about just a couple more disease-related things, but before I forget, when you had mentioned, if CWD gets into the population, say goodbye to a lot of those 6-7-year-old bucks, which are the big trophies here, and it brings up something that talked to over and over again with hunters in the Northeast, not just Massachusetts in general, but New Hampshire, Maine, where it seems like their biggest rack potential and their biggest racks that they have on their heads is not 5, which is what the Midwest says is, the peak antler potential for a buck. Up here, it does seem like it's 7, 6, 7, 8 years old sometimes, where it's their biggest rack potential. Do you know anything about that, or any theories about it?
I don't have any theories as to why it is, but that is certainly what we see as well in the data, that they are kind of hitting this peak a little bit later than what you have in the Midwest. I am from Wisconsin, and so I grew up with that model of deer management. I went to University of Wisconsin for my undergrad too, and there it's such a more agriculturally produced deer in many ways, and I don't know if it's the diet having implications there, but also the Midwest now has had CWD as a driver for a very long time. Yeah. So in pretty much every population you're looking at, with the exceptions of like the very northern woods in a couple of states, they're really having a lot of chronic wasting disease, a pretty high prevalence. And so some of that is going to be probably from that as well, where you're just not getting
that old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But certainly, I think nutrition is probably a big part of it, of that difference, because those are corn-fed deer predominantly.
Yeah. Right.
Versus here, it's a very different diet.
All right. Somebody had asked about acidosis. I don't know what that is, but you probably do.
Yep. So acidosis is something that a lot of folks are concerned about when it comes to feeding deer during the winter. And it does occur. And it's something that was a much bigger deal when we had harsher winters. And it's also often talked about as to why you shouldn't feed deer or other wildlife during the winter. Because effectively what happens is their diet, the whole gut changes over on a deer for the winter. Entirely different kind of processing with the bacteria within their rumen. And so with that, when you all of a sudden have a really high caloric and the sugar that you have in corn, that then really messes with the bacteria, and that produces acid, which then causes acidosis and can be lethal. It's not commonly lethal. I frankly discourage wildlife feeding more because of the actual impacts on the animal itself. You're changing their entire diet. You're changing the bacteria that they have in their diet. They have a whole naturally evolved seasonality to what they're eating. And when you start putting, whether it be corn or any other food source out there, you're really starting to mess with that natural fauna. And while it may not have impacts in that first year, over time, as you start messing with the actual physiology of the animal that was evolved to be able to handle that local habitat and the local vegetation, you really are starting to mess with the whole health of that animal. And so that's why people shouldn't feed deer during the winter, not because they're that concerned about acidosis, which it occurs, but it's a relatively rare occurrence.
I bet in places like Ohio, I don't know how much you would communicate with biologists there and know what they're dealing with, but in a heavily baiting state where everybody has giant corn piles everywhere, they must, that must be actually doing some long-term change to their biome or their internal, how they're, if that continues for, let's just say, 300 years, that deer 300 years from now is going to, their whole internal system is going to be different than it was 50 years ago.
Yeah, and that's sort of like what I said earlier too, with the Midwestern deer being corn-fed. That's actually kind of the example of why acidosis is not that much of a concern. There are a lot of deer across North America that are eating a lot of corn as their primary diet during the winter, and including pretty harsh winters there in Wisconsin, Minnesota, etc. And it's still a very rare occurrence. The problem is more all the other impacts, and we do strongly discourage feeding during the winter. There's just not the need for it here. Northern Maine, where they have to do it because they have those winter mortalities, that's a different situation. But here in Massachusetts, there's nothing about these winters that require that feeding, and frankly, you start just manipulating the behavior of the deer. Now, we do support the use of food plots if folks want to be able to, grow clover and get some of the good ground cover. We support that. And actually, one of the other regulations that's in this package finally clarifies this, because this has been an area where the environmental police and MassWildlife have had disagreements in terms of the interpretation of existing regulation. And so we really wanted to clarify that hunting over food plots and growing food plots is an activity we support.
Awesome. And we're going to get into those in a second here. What about talking about statutes versus regulations? The introduction of being able to hunt over bait, would that be a statute or a regulation?
That would be a regulation.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's right now it's the same set of regulations that are opened up for the food plot.
Because I don't want to I don't want to turn into Ohio,
Yeah, I frankly, from a chronic wasting disease perspective, we wouldn't want to open up bait. The only time where we'd ever consider that is going to be more from a direct management perspective, and that's very different than the way that states like Ohio and Wisconsin and Alabama and some of the other states that allow baiting, where it is a much wider tool. If we were to allow it, it would be for something like urban deer management, where you have a plot, you have the 1 acre plot that is the only thing that anyone can actually shoot on in a small area. Maybe we would eventually consider something like that. But we don't want that across the landscape. There's too many impacts on other animals too, because it messes with all the other animals that have access to that bait, their diets as well. And we would never go that route of having open use of bait. It also increases disease transmission and lots of other risks associated.
What is the requirement, or I don't even know how to ask it, but what determines what is a regulation that can be influenced by you guys and what is a statute?
Yeah. So essentially, legislators can pass whatever laws they want, and statutes trump regulation. So if tomorrow the legislature decided to pass a law that removed our authority, they could. There's nothing we can do about it, and then and it has to be passed by the legislature, signed by the governor, etc. But we then work within our delegated authority. So our delegated authority is underneath the powers of the director, as given by the legislature under state statute. Most of that being under Chapter 131 of the Massachusetts general laws, and then those then allow us to then promulgate regulations, which are then under the CMRs, the Code of Massachusetts Regulations, and we have a section of regulations that are our authority delegated by the legislature.
So basically, it's just if there's already a law that, for instance, the setback law or no Sunday hunting, no moose hunting, that's obviously something that would have to be changed through this through the government, through your Congress and the whole situation. But if there's something that isn't written into law, that's where there's probably not a law right now that says you can't bait deer. So technically, in theory, in the future, MassWildlife can introduce that as a regulation just because it hasn't been already written into a law, right?
So as long as the legislature hasn't passed a law taking away a right or that, then we can do that. I mean, and these things change all the time. A good example is the gun bill, where we faced a lot of backlash where the public was like, well, why aren't you guys pushing back on that? And ultimately, that's a law passed by legislators. It's not our authority to supersede that. We can only write regulations within what is actually available areas of law.
Okay, let's talk about the process now of proposing a new regulation. MassWildlife, comes up with new regulations, and then you put it in front of the Fish and Game Board. And can you talk about how that board is formed, and kind of that process?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, as we have different project leaders that work on our different taxa, and in my case with the deer, and so I regularly am doing reviews of the current regulations, things we'd want to change, things for management implications, those kinds of things. And so in this case, we'll put together an actual package of regulations that I'd like to change. It can be a pretty long list. So this year's list, I had originally started, I think, around 15 regulation changes. And then that would then internally goes to our wildlife section. So we get feedback from other wildlife biologists, our district managers, and because each of us have different perspectives that we bring to the table on these things. Then it'll go to a senior staff after that, and that includes kind of the top of the administration of our agency. And at each of these levels, things get kind of pulled out. And so then, and also we are constantly doing kind of iterative process. So the regulation changes, the language and stuff is getting more solidified as it moves on. We also have review with the environmental police, and so they're able to then have feedback added to this process and how they would actually implement this, because ultimately, if we pass a regulation, they're the ones that are actually enforcing it. So we got to make sure we're on the same page as to the intent and those kinds of things. And then after it goes through that internal process, then I will present it as the deer biologist to the Fish and Wildlife Board. That board is made up of several different representatives that cover things like agriculture, actual academic wildlife, and then also regional representation from across the state. And then so we make that recommendation to the board. Then they will essentially take that recommendation and decide if they want to approve the regulation change in concept to go to hearing. And so then if they approve that, which is what occurred for this deer package last June, then from there it goes up through kind of all the legal levels of government, all the way up to the Attorney General review, but also secretary levels and things between that. And that can take several months. So that section was approved to go to hearing in June of last year, and it wasn't approved by the administration to go to hearing until December. So that entire time between, there's lots of legal review through the levels of government. And then the governor's administration then approves regulations to go to hearing. So that's where we're at now, is to actually have the hearing, which includes both an in-person, or well, in this case, hybrid, but essentially an actual timed hearing where people can actually give voiced opinions on a regulation package, as well as a written submission period where folks can submit written comment. And then after we go through all that and we get all that feedback from the public, I will make the final recommendation to the board based on all that feedback. They then approve or disapprove of it, and then it does the whole ladder up again, and then at that point, it's promulgated. So it's a long process, generally 14 to 17 months or so to get a regulation through.
And so are they appointed, or how is the board, how do the board get their seats?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so the board, those seats are all appointed by the commissioner. And the commissioner is then appointed by the governor. So our current board, I believe all of them were appointed by Ron Amidon, the previous commissioner.
The commissioner of MassWildlife?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, the commissioner of Department of Fish and Game.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And MassWildlife sits under that department?
Yes, there's DFG is our parent or agency. This all gets kind of confusing, but MassWildlife is the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. There's also the Division of Marine Fisheries, and then there's also the Division of Restoration Ecology. I might have that name off a little bit. And all of that is then what makes up the Department of Fish and Game.
Okay.
Which is where the commissioner oversees.
I gotcha. And the commissioner, you said, is appointed by the governor?
Yep.
Okay. And is there any, when they appoint a commissioner, is there any consideration into, are they a hunter? Are they a fisherman? Are they a biologist? Or how is that generally done?
Yeah, I mean, the appointment, that process looks different depending on each administration. The current commissioner, Tom O'Shea, actually used to be our assistant director of wildlife, and so he had the role of my current supervisor, and so has lots of background, internally on that. Ron came more from the hunting and fishing end of things. We did a lot of the sportsmen's councils, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it varies quite a bit on that, but certainly, I think most commissioners across government, the idea is to have someone who certainly has the
Some
knowledge,
experience
in that field. And like Tom O'Shea, has lots of that experience, having been, the assistant director of wildlife previously.
That's great. But every time there's a new governor, then that commissioner is most likely going to be a new one, right?
Yeah, it doesn't have to happen that way, but that's generally going to be the case. Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about some of these regulations. We're at an hour and 50 minutes here. We don't really have an end time, but let's go through the regulations here. So the first one, clarification that food plots are legal to hunt.
Yep, and the important thing there, essentially this would allow both that food plots that can be used to hunt over, but also anyone using traditional or standard gardening or agricultural practices of like shooting over a field. Currently, some officers would enforce that as baiting if you were, hunting on an apple orchard, for example, because the apples are present. And we're trying from an agricultural damage standpoint of actually trying to have more hunters come onto those properties to help out farmers. And so this would clarify that that is not considered baiting, as long as you aren't physically, loading up, corn from the field or pumpkins or apples and placing them. As long as it was from a regular gardening practice, or if you're having a food plot like clover or something like that, that'd be completely legal.
That's awesome. So the CWD prevention, basically we talked about that at sunsetting the...
Yeah, so that'd be for sunsetting the captive deer facilities that are all the remaining ones, and then also expanding the deboning requirements to any state outside of New England.
The winter primitive season. Now this one's super interesting. So you guys are proposing a winter primitive season for zones 13 and 14.
Yep.
Which is what, essentially Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard?
Yep, and then also Chappaquiddick, the Elizabeth Islands, and Tuckernuck as well. And so this, to be clear, is just kind of an initial step for those. We intend to also propose the January season here on the mainland in Eastern Mass, but we want to at least initially have a lot of pressure there for that first season to be able to increase that harvest, kind of get that first pulse. It would be a month-long season beginning the first day of January, first non-Sunday of January, and then run through the month of January. Archery or primitive equipment. They would have to buy the primitive stamp as well as the new license year, because this would be a new license year for that January season. The hunters would be able to utilize their new buck tags on that new license year if they so choose. And so you'd have those 2 new buck tags. If they film that January, they can't use them the following fall, but you theoretically would be able to have access to those right away that first January. You also will be able to buy the new unlimited antlerless permits for that January season. Any of those that you don't use, you'd be able to use that coming fall. And then one of the new opportunities here is a winter permit that'll only be eligible for that January season and only for the islands. Even if we expand this to the rest of the state, where that winter permit's just going to be for the islands, and that would be an either sex permit, allowing a third buck to be taken. So you could choose to use it for an antlerless deer if you so choose, but it would also allow you to use it for a buck, and this changes the season bag limit on bucks as well. And the reason for that is that the islands have now had unlimited antlerless permits available since 1988. And so with that, the sex ratio has gotten completely out of whack. You have a ton of bucks running around, and you have a finite number of hunters that can access the islands, because it's not like you can just drive to the next town. You have all the logistics of getting to the island. And so there really is a finite number of bucks that can be harvested each year, just because of the finite number of hunters that can access that.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of a unique opportunity here where you'd be able to actually harvest that third buck in that January season. And then we likely will have this expand to other zones here in the regulation package going to the board here this spring. But for at least the first year, this would be focused just on zones 13 and 14.
What are possible negative effects on introducing that to places outside of the islands? Just for instance, me thinking about, let's say the area I was talking about earlier, it has 20 does, and there's a lot of bucks too. I have seen 11 or 12 different bucks in there this year. If this were passed and was also part of the zone that I'm hunting, I could shoot 2 bucks, November, December of, let's say, 2026, and then January comes, buy my primitive stamp, get my tags for the year, buck tags. I could shoot 2 more of that same bachelor group and same breeding season, essentially, right? So then I just feel like that could be pretty dangerous in some places.
Yeah, so it's a very good question. And the primary thing to keep in mind here is that the number of hunters is declining every single year, and every hunter is still capped at those 2 bucks. And so right now we're looking at a decline of about 5% every single year. And if you look at the actual buck harvest, even with the fact we have a declining number of hunters in all of those eastern zones, including even zone 9 and some of the zones even throughout the valley and western regions of the state, we're seeing exponential growth now in terms of the bucks that are actually being harvested. And that's because of the fact we're seeing these populations grow. And so even all this is really going to effectively do, since you still are going to have that cap on the 2 bucks, is you're moving that to 1 year earlier, 1 season earlier. But bucks don't matter from a reproductive standpoint, because any buck can inseminate unlimited does theoretically. And so it's not going to have much on a population level impact. And really what you're effectively doing is you're moving some of those harvests to the outgoing hunting population, because we're losing that 4 to 5, 6% every single year. And so that it's an important concern, but that's part of it from a mathematics standpoint, is you're not really going to see much of an impact there, because of the fact you're just moving that harvest activity. And the other thing to keep in mind there too is like the antlerless permits. If we're going to have an antlerless permit that we have on the front end, like zone 9, for example, we can then adjust the antlerless permits for the coming season. We're already seeing demand be an issue in terms of too low of a demand. This last season, zone 9 permits took 5 days to sell out. So there were actually hunters out there with 6 ADPs in zone 9 because of the fact they take so long to sell out.
Yeah.
And that's not really good from just a equitable standpoint where you have, folks doing that, but it's also not good from a deer management standpoint, because someone who's buying 5 ADPs, the odds that they actually fill them is relatively slim. By now expanding this and having a longer season, that can address it. But ultimately, everything when it comes to the implementation of that season and stuff, that's all for later discussion. But we're gonna it's just an important thing to keep in mind, because I've certainly heard some feedback from folks on the islands that are concerned that this is this unique thing that's just gonna be for the islands, when in reality is it's more of a full approach across all of the overabundant zones in eastern Mass.
Has any other state done a program similar to this that you're aware of?
In terms of a late season, or?
Well, yeah, I guess I don't really know how it works in other states, but where it feels like, even though it's it's the next calendar year, it's still, most hunters, it's just an extension of that same season, where the next year's tags become available. And do other states do that?
That's all varies depending on how the state has their license structure. So when MassWildlife went through a review of licenses, I believe about a decade ago or so, and there was a discussion about making it a seasonal, where rather than having it be a calendar year, having it be a season oriented. And the decision at that point was to do it as a calendar year. At this point, we wouldn't deviate from that, just because it's sort of kind of locked in. But there's pros and cons to it. It's certainly, I guess, one of the benefits from a management perspective is it gets people to buy their licenses early, and that sort of commits them that coming year. The hope would be that we can reduce some of that fall off of the number of hunters, and creates more opportunity on that end. But ultimately, what this also does is make the primitive stamp much more valuable, because right now the primitive stamp only gets you about 2.5 to 3 weeks of hunting, depending on how long Thanksgiving is or how late Thanksgiving is. And with this, now that primitive stamp is worth both those 2.5 weeks plus the full month of January, then in 13 and 14, and potentially other zones here in the future.
While we're on the topic of new hunting regulations getting proposed by MassWildlife, and then trying to figure out which things fall under the legislature, where you might have to contact your local congressman or state senator, it can get a little bit confusing. I'm on the board of directors for the Mass Bowhunters Association. We've been around in the state of Massachusetts for over 40 years fighting for bowhunters' rights. And what the organization does first and foremost is we act as your voice to the state legislatures. We have good connections with MassWildlife and mutually beneficial relationships. We have an open line of communication to the right people. So we can do a lot of that work for you. If you'd like to become a member, you can go to massbowhunters.com. But what I'd really like to talk about is how we raise funds. Yes, the memberships is a big part of it, but the biggest part of raising funds to make sure that Mass Bowhunters can operate is the annual banquet. And the banquet this year is going to be April 12th, 2025 in Athol, Massachusetts at the Ellenwood Country Club. It's $40 per ticket. There's a meal provided for you. There's a lot of great items in live auctions, silent auctions, and raffles. There's going to be virtual shooting by Pettingill Archery. There's going to be a lot of great programming happening at the banquet. And so if you'd like to support what we're doing and you would like your voice to be represented through Mass Bowhunters Association, please come out and support it. We're going to put the link to the banquet in the description here. There's only 150 tickets. I think we've already sold through 75 of them or so. So get on there, grab the last 75 tickets. Bring some money to support the auctions and stuff, as that is the largest fundraising event for Mass Bowhunters Association. And again, we are the voice for any bow hunters in Massachusetts and do a lot of that work for you guys in contacting legislatures, doing some lobbying on behalf of bow hunters' rights. And we would appreciate the support. I'd love to see you guys there. April 12th, 1 to 5 p.m. at Ellenwood Country Club in Athol, Massachusetts. Click the link below, and we appreciate your support. So there's a couple other ones, the shed hunting one. So clarifying that shed hunting is legal.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of people talking about that one.
Yeah, and I think there's been quite a bit of confusion on that one as well. So this is one where, as we've already discussed at length, with statutes, we can't modify statutes. And the best we can do is work within the legal framework that they have. And there's actually a statute that goes back to quite a few decades ago, back when we were trying to really save deer. And so with that, there was a restriction put on place for the possession of deer and any of their parts, that they had to be coming from a tagged deer. Not that they are currently tagged, but that they had to be actually from a tagged deer. And that would be all the parts thereof in terms of the statutory language. And that has always put us in kind of a gray spot here when it comes to shed hunting, because it's not actually from a tagged deer, and it is still part of that animal. And essentially, the environmental police, in collaboration with MassWildlife, has always just been on the side of, we're not going to enforce it. But that puts us in an awkward situation where we want our community to be able to actually go out and hunt, or to go shed hunting. It's a great activity. It's a great activity to take your kids out. It creates that immediate relationship with deer from a young age. It's a healthy activity. It's an off-season activity. Like, everything about it is something we want to promote. We want to be able to have MassWildlife having stories about it and all that. Yep. But because it wasn't technically legal, we couldn't do that. And so what this finally does once and for all is clarifies that it is legal. It exempts permitting. This has been something that there's also been some confusion. Some folks have thought that it meant that we are permitting it. No, this actually exempts the requirement.
Another way for MassWildlife to get a...
Exactly.
A new stamp fee.
Exactly. So that is not the case whatsoever here. If you think the status quo is that it is legal for you to do it, well, then this doesn't change one thing for you. But in terms of what it allows us to do is to actually now promote shed hunting and every positive aspect to it. And so that's it's an important thing for us to do, even though it's not necessarily changing the enforcement end of it. What it's doing is really allowing us to now promote that activity.
That's great. And then decoys, being able to use decoys while bow hunting.
Yeah, so this was one where we had different discussions initially. As I said earlier, when I'm talking about regulations, I try to make them as simplistic as possible. And initially, when I was putting this forth, I was focused on actually just trying to open up deer decoys across the board. Most of our bordering states have them open across the board. However, in Rhode Island, Connecticut, there are restrictions. And so I decided, like as the group, we decided that it was best to start a little restrictive on this and to make it archery only. That way it reduces some of that safety concern, at least initially. Decoys are a really beneficial way of being able to draw in deer without having some of the health risks of doing things like baiting that we certainly don't want to ever support. And so this also, I think decoys now in the era of social media also add much more to the kind of communication about hunting, because hunters, I have seen so many hunters who will literally pass on deer and some incredible bucks because they see them coming with a decoy, and you get to have those experiences.
Oh yeah.
You know, those experiences that you get up in a stand where you get to see deer do these crazy things, you know, those wild things. And decoys allow you to have that opportunity. So it's a healthy thing in terms of the deer. It's a great opportunity for hunters to be able to get out with them. And it's just an activity we want to be able to support.
Yeah, and even the bow decoys too, where if you are, I enjoy ground hunting with my bow. Being on the ground makes that experience even, more personal and up close and personal. Those bow decoys would be cool. I was actually hunting a couple years ago here in suburban where we're at, suburban Massachusetts, and I watched somebody with a bow decoy. It was illegal because you're not supposed to do that, but I was watching him just working the edge of this swamp that I was overlooking. I was like, I had to go back and read. I was like, can you do? I thought you couldn't use decoys. But yeah, that would be an interesting one. I would definitely utilize that bow decoy attachment. And then removing the daily antlerless bag limit.
Yep, so this is another one where there's been a little bit of confusion. So effectively right now, the biggest limitation when it comes to the bag limit is that on the mainland in zones 1 through 12, you can possess up to 2 deer without having it checked in, and up to 4 if you're in zones 13 and 14. That predominantly has 2 barriers. One, if you're in an area where you don't have access to the internet. So if you're going to be in a rural portion of Western Mass, or really any place where you don't have access to be able to do online check, you essentially have to stop hunting after you harvest 2 deer. And as we're seeing the densities rise in some of those places, like zones 1 and 3 and even 4 north, we want to make sure that if folks have those antlerless permits in their pocket, which is specifically because we're trying to have those deer be harvested, we want those hunters to be able to take those deer without having to have that barrier in the way. The other issue there is with Biological Deer Check Week, where you have to actually go to a physical check station. Now for anyone across the state, you get those first 2 deer in the morning, you have to stop. And we want you to be able to go and continue to harvest more deer. And if you have those extra antlerless permits, it's precisely because we are wanting you to harvest them. And so that's really just to remove those barriers.
Yep, that's great. And then kind of on that same lines is authorizing youth, if they have a youth permit, to be able to use it throughout the whole season, right?
Yeah, this is a particular big one for me. I want to make sure that we are promoting youth hunting. It's so important that we get that next generation hunting. And it is certainly a barrier, that, particularly for the younger 2 years of youth hunting, where you have to hunt on your parents' licenses. If you got a parent that is a prolific hunter and is going to fill their 2 buck tags, you're taking away that potential opportunity for them to be out with their parent and be able to actually take a buck. And if you're in a zone where you have restricted antlerless permit restrictions, you're not going to have access to those extra antlerless permits, even if you are a youth hunter, throughout the season. And so what this would do is just make that either sex youth permit that right now is only eligible on the youth deer day. You still can use it on that day, and you still can use the other antlerless permits on that day. But now that youth deer permit can be used all season long, any open deer season.
Have you thought about a novice tag, like similar to what Vermont does? That allowed me to get my best friend from college who he was a big fisherman, never hunted. I was trying to convince him for years he should get into it. Then when the novice program started, I was like, let's go, let's do it. And he got into it, and now he's a super dedicated hunter. It's going to be in his life, passed down to his kids. I mean, I think that's a pretty cool program for adult hunters who have never, had a mentor.
Yeah, we've talked about several different models like that. So we've talked about a version like that for new hunters. We've talked about a version for veterans, which has also been a request. We've also had requests for senior citizen hunters as well. Each of those have kind of pros and cons of how you balance it out with antlerless permit allocations and such. I think we are certainly heading down a trajectory where we are trying to add more permit access. And so while it's not a part of this package, it certainly is something that we will continue to evaluate. Because in general, right now, with the declining number of hunters and the rising deer population, I got to balance that equation. And one of the ways you can do that is by increasing permit availability.
Yeah. Cool. And we've gone pretty long here, but we've got one more thing I kind of want to talk about, and then if you have anything that we didn't touch on. But a lot of people are asking about leashed dog recovery of wounded game animals. You guys have been at Huntstock for the last few years. We always do a great demonstration there with United Blood Tracking Dog out of New Hampshire, Mike LaFleur and his dog. And there's a lot of people that are wondering why that isn't a part of, is it a regulation or is it a statute?
Yes, this is a tough one. And this is actually another one where I'm personally trying to, it's a high priority for me. I mean, it's a high priority for a lot of people at our agency, including our board and several of our staff members. In New York, I had the opportunity to work with a lot of blood trackers that were licensed blood trackers there in New York. And one of the big negatives that we see in terms of retention of hunters is when you have, particularly a nice deer that someone loses.
Just makes you quit the game
Exactly.
forever.
So many hunters, we hear that it's the end of their season. Sometimes it's the end of them hunting altogether. And being able to increase those recovery rates and reduce those negative impacts, both from a resource perspective, but also just in terms of that retention of hunters is really important. Now, we go right up into the head with statutes in this case, and there's a statute and how it's around hunting and how hunting is defined that becomes an issue because it's actually under state statute that you can't hunt using a dog for deer. And the problem there is the way that the legal system in Massachusetts has interpreted hunting that includes everything from the pursuit of the animal
until you recover it.
Exactly. And so that's the challenge. We've talked about a lot of different options for working around that, and it's something that is a high priority for this current board, and so we are working on options of moving around it. Several of the states around us, including even New York, had the same issues where it was a statutory limitation, and so there are ways we could do it in terms of having a special permit specifically for blood trackers. With the statute as is, it would be very difficult for us to legally ever have it where anyone could use their dog, because that, at least the way hunting is currently interpreted in Massachusetts, that would defy that. But there are potential ways that we could define the requirements around it, and that's the legal pathway we're working on.
Yeah, like finding like a licensed tracker in the state. Like, I think Vermont does that too.
Yeah.
So in New Hampshire or those other states where it was you said New York, where it was a statute, did they just they didn't go through the legislature and get that statute removed? They
did under a special permit. Yeah. So and there are a lot of things that we can do via special permit, and this would be one of the actions we do. So this is it's definitely a high priority for us, and it's something we've been already working on the groundwork now for well over a year on. It's just
cool.
that these things are difficult because anytime we're in a situation where we are working on something that would deviate from a statutory piece, we have to make sure it's very legally sound, because there's some legal risk there. But
yeah. Awesome. Great. Yeah, I think that was an awesome conversation. I don't know if you have anything else you want to add.
That was great. Enjoy it. Anyone who's interested in terms of the regulation, if you're able to make it to the actual the regulatory hearings, we have those on Thursday at 1 p.m. and at 6 p.m. But then on top of that, we will have written comment available into February as well. And folks can find that information online with MassWildlife regulatory hearings and submit their comment. And
And I'm going to put that in the YouTube description here, too. It'll link you guys right to the information about those hearings. It'll be tomorrow, because this is coming out the day before the hearing. So when you're watching this, it'll be tomorrow, 1:30 p.m. and 6 p.m. is what I saw in the email.
I got to get there early. I forgot about that. That makes sense.
So try to attend one of those. And if you have any questions for Martin, maybe, I'll ask him after this, but maybe we'll put his email in the link description too.
Yep. I'm a public employee. All my stuff's all public. So
awesome. Well, thank you very much for coming. I enjoyed that.
yeah, me too.